On the 11th of March 2011, as we were finalizing the production of these videos, a massive earthquake, Richter 8.9, and tsunamis hit Japan. These images give some indication of the horror of the experience and the massive damage done by some quite small waves. This DVD presents a wide range of evidence that indicates that at some stage in the history of the Earth, waves hundreds of times greater than these rampaged the Earth, together with massive Earth movements, and totally reformed the surface of the Earth. We consider evidence that every landform that you're familiar with is a consequence of massive Earth movement and massive water forces, and we consider the possibility that this did not happen so long ago, and that it warns of a possible future judgment. I would like to give you an overview of the suite of presentations that's on this DVD set. In the introduction, we'll give you an overview of some important engineering and logical principles for the analysis of information, talk a little bit about my credentials and the basis on which I come before you to present this information. We'll then look at some key observations from outer space that point to long-term instability in the universe and around the Earth, and talk about the ready availability of large volumes of water in the form of ice in space. We'll then look at Northcliffe as the pivot point of a wide diversity of geological and topographic information that points to a global flood. We'll look at massively contorted surface geology and massively faulted formations, and we'll say that this gives evidence of massive uniform hydraulic action and massive disruption of the Earth's surface. There are many other topics discussed in this series, including globally occurring evidence of sedimentary rocks and associated massive water action, evidence of massive uniform landform cutting action indicative of massive uniform hydraulic action, a discussion of the age of these landforms and a discussion of the relative merits of different aging theories, and looks at the possibility of there having been judgments by the Creator. I really encourage you to watch the entire series, but if you are really time-stressed, then video 10 summarizes all of this, and video 11 offers some other challenging information about the matters of the Creator. I really hope that you will find this useful and informative, and look forward to your feedback. I would like to start this presentation with a caution and a special request. There's a very large amount of material in this presentation that is controversial. Please focus on what you can agree with and park those things you cannot agree with for future consideration, or discard them. I truly believe there is much of value in what follows, and I urge you to focus on what is valuable to you. I'd like to acknowledge the input of Jonathan Gray. It was his material that triggered the thinking on which this presentation is based, and tied in with many areas of my experience which I'd seen very differently until I came across his material. Hi, I'm James Robertson. By training, I'm a civil engineer. I have a bachelor's degree and a PhD in civil engineering, specializing in geotechnical engineering. I have a number of years working experience in mining geotechnics, and I've worked on a number of large mines throughout Southern Africa. I've been interested in geology all of my life, and I grew up in Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm here to share with you some information which I'm really excited about. I happen also to be a believer in the Creator, Yah the eternally self-existing, and I happen to believe that the Bible is a reasonably reliable historical document. But I'm not here to tell you much about that right now. I want to show you
some hard, rock hard, in fact, evidence that I regard as valuable and which I believe will help you to take a new view on the world you live in. I'm going to talk based on my environment, based on where I've spent the last 56 years of my life, give or take a few times out of the city, and quite a lot of international travel. I'm going to share with you some information which in my mind absolutely definitively indicates that there was a worldwide global flood in which the entire planet was covered with water and the entire surface of the earth was massively destroyed and reshaped. And I'm going to do that with evidence that I can give you from my life experience with photographs taken in my hometown and the immediate vicinity. So sit down, get yourself comfortable, and I want to take you on what I hope will be a really exciting ride. Here we go.
As you may have picked up by training, I'm a civil engineer. For the last 21 years, I've been engaged in business advising large corporate clients on how to get the most value out of their computerized business information systems. In doing that, I've sought to bring, quote, the disciplines of engineering to the information technology industry. In applying that principle, I've come to do a lot of thinking about engineering and why it is that when engineers design things, they generally work. And one of the things that I would suggest for your consideration, that you live in a space where bridges stand up. The interesting thing about that, though, is I came to the realization about 10 years ago that engineers do not design bridges to stand up. And you may recall this bridge in Minneapolis, which collapsed in about 2008, killing 14 people and injuring 114. And it is so that the people who died that day drove onto that bridge with absolutely no expectation that their lives were in danger, because it is so that bridges designed by engineers just do not fall down as part of our experience. And I came to understand that engineers do not design bridges to stand up. They design bridges not to fall down. And there's a fundamental difference in approach in designing a bridge not to fall down. I would suggest that in formulating any view of history, in formulating any theory about the formation of the surface of the earth, that theory should stand up to critical scrutiny, and in fact that theory should stand up and not fall down. And in order to ensure that your theory of topographic formation, your theory of the history of the earth does not fall down, you need to subject it to critical examination. So what is not an engineering approach? When I was young, I used to dream of standing on a chair in a crowded room and waving my arms and flying gently around the room talking to people. If you've never had an experience like that, maybe you should order that sort of dream. But if I was to stand on top of one of these buildings and jump off waving my arms shouting, "I can fly, I could fly," I would almost certainly plummet to my death in a bloody mess. And so it's important that in formulating theories of the history of the earth that we do not resort to abstract philosophical debates which are analogous to a magician conjuring a rabbit out of a hat. Our theories must be solid, they must be robust, they must stand up to scrutiny. In the work that I do as a business consultant and strategist, one of the things that I found 20 years ago was that I could not concisely define strategy. I came across the work of Professor Malcolm MacDonald, who says that strategy is doing the right things and that tactics is doing things right, and if you do the right things well, your organization will thrive. And I suggest for your consideration that any theory of the history of the earth, any theory of the history of the mountains and rivers and valleys that surround us, should stand up to scrutiny in order for mankind to thrive. So what is strategy? The right things done right, the essence of why an organization exists and how it thrives, the essence of why a theory exists and how it supports humanity to thrive. In standing before you today, I do so with some credentials which I think are important in light of certain comments that were made to me when I first started to present these theories to people. I have a number of academic achievements, including a degree as a Doctor of Philosophy, various awards that have come my way as a result of various work that I've done. And so I would ask you to consider that I don't stand here without some intellectual and academic background to support me. One of the principles that one learns as an engineer, and in fact one learns at school if one takes mathematics, is a principle called reductio ad absurdum. It's an approach to proving theorems which says assume that the theorem is valid and work through all the necessary consequences of it being valid and see whether they in fact support the theorem. And if the outcome of assuming that the theorem is valid is absurd, then you have a proof by contradiction. Reductio ad absurdum is a widely acknowledged principle. You will find at the time that I researched this presentation 182,000 occurrences of that phrase on the internet. Defined by Wikipedia, reductio ad absurdum, form of argument in which a proposition is disproven by following its implications to a logical but absurd consequence. And I will use reductio ad absurdum a number of times during this presentation, and I've applied it considerably in arriving at the conclusions that I present to you. Again, my point, what I have to share with you today has been carefully thought through and analyzed. Some other credentials in terms of my employment: my father's investment consultancy, specializing in South African gold shares. So when I talk about the gold mines of South Africa, I'm talking from a fundamental first principles understanding of the economics and mechanics of gold mining. International Mining and Geotechnical Consultancy, which took me to various mines around Southern Africa, and then my own consultancy over the last 22 years in terms of the strategic application of information technology and critical thinking in business. Some other credentials: I'm a member of a number of internationally recognized professional institutions, and my point in sharing this with you is simply, again, in order to become a member of these organizations, one has to go through professional scrutiny. So I'm not standing up here without some basis to claim what I'm talking to you about. My interest in geology goes back to my early childhood. One of my father's best friends was a mining engineer. I've been down a diversity of types of mine, both underground and open cast. I studied geology at university as part of my civil engineering degree, and my PhD relates to the use of cement stabilized soils for the construction of large dams, which included the manufacture of rock-like material through the application of pressure and cement. So when I talk to you about the formation of rocks, again, I speak from first-hand experience. Consulting with regard to mine geotechnics, I've spoken about already, and an ongoing interest in geology and topography as I travel around. And also, by the way, at one stage in my life, I undertook quite a detailed study of ceramics. So when I speak to you about ceramic materials, again, I'm speaking from first-hand knowledge and experience. I've alluded to my mining experience and just a few mines that I've been involved with, each one of which occurs with massive sedimentary deposits, which I will talk about in more detail later in this presentation. And so again, when I talk about the geology of Southern Africa, I do so from first-hand experience of having worked with the material. As I've mentioned, my PhD was undertaken into the use of cement-stabilized soils for the construction of large dams, which involved compressed and cemented soils converted into weak rock. Various tests, including compressive strength, shear strength, permeability, leaching, and various other tests. You'll see some of the apparatus that I used on the right-hand side of the screen and the results of one of the tests at the bottom. Interestingly, while I was putting this presentation together, I went back to my PhD thesis and pulled out some samples of the test results that occur. And what you will notice is that virtually every one of those test results follows an exponential curve, which is summarized by the red line in the middle at the bottom of the screen here. And you will see that even where there are portions of the characteristic which appear linear, subsequently as you go further down the curve or up the curve, a nonlinear characteristic is experienced. This is fundamentally important to understanding what follows. It is a reality that in so-called nature, in the physical world, very, very few physical characteristics follow an ongoing linear trend. And in considering some of the widely held theories that are prevalent with regard to topographic formation, it is absolutely vital to keep this in mind. Most strength, decay, and other characteristics are exponential. Change follows an exponential trajectory. The bed load and sediment load in water follows an exponential trajectory. Your car follows an exponential trajectory when you change direction. And it is so that extrapolation from the tail end of an exponential distribution, especially on the basis of linear assumptions, is highly inadvisable, as you will see by contrasting the blue line and the red line on the screen right now. Another fundamental engineering principle: extrapolation should be avoided, not something that you should do. And a search on Google turns up that there are a huge number of instances, over 6 million web pages with those words on the same page, 965 pages with the exact phrase, extrapolation should be avoided. Engineering principles say that you work by interpolation. You do not work by extrapolation. If you have to extrapolate, you extrapolate only incrementally, and then you confirm it in the laboratory or in some other form of testing. You do not extrapolate millions of times outside the domain of the available information. So it's time for a reality check, ladies and gentlemen. On the web we find numerous mentions to billions of years old. We'll find opinions expressed as to the age of the Earth going back 4.55 billion years with a tolerance of 1%. 7.5 million entries on the internet for a million years old. 3.5 million entries for a billion years old. Laughter, 16 million years old. Figure out how you arrive at that. And then the statement, which is from an engineering point of view highly provocative, quote, "The generally accepted age for the Earth and the rest of the solar system is about 4.55 billion years, plus or minus about 1%. In engineering terms, you would not express that level of certainty if you were interpolating, let alone when you're extrapolating to the tune of 4.5 billion years. How reliable are these figures? What if there was some radical change in the environment that has not been taken into account by the people who postulate these theories, and they are only theories? I want to suggest for your consideration that extrapolation over millions or billions of years is invalid. To try and make what I'm seeing visible to you, I'd like to suggest it's tantamount to an ant on a railway track, claiming to know where the train has come from and how long it took to get there and the route that it followed just by looking at the oncoming train. It's clearly manifestly ridiculous. So I'd like to ask you to take a reality check on your historical theories. Are the theories that you have, that you subscribe to, about the formation of the Earth, the formation of the hills and mountains and valleys around you, tantamount to conjuring a rabbit out of a hat or jumping off a high-rise building, shouting, "I can fly," and flapping your arms? Or are they solid and robust? Do they stand up to in-depth scrutiny? So what if, at some point in the past, there was a massive catastrophic event that totally reshaped the surface of the Earth? Maybe not that long ago. Would the ants see anything different? Would aging calculations be turned upside down? Is it possible that ancient historical writings might be accurate? A little bit of religious and spiritual background. I grew up in the Church of England, or Anglican Church. In my 20s, I walked away disillusioned with hypocrisy and a bad attitude. I found the church teaching did not fit, was not practical, was illogical, was inconsistent. I was told to believe the book or the Bible, but found that the church ignored the book and that what the church taught was in contradiction of what was in the book. Close to the age of 40 and the point of death, I had a massive and dramatic encounter with the Almighty where He spoke to me audibly in a way that I suddenly knew with absolute certainty that He existed. Since then, I have had numerous incidents which have given rise to a deep, evidentially based conviction that the Almighty Creator exists and is real. In coming to that conclusion, I've applied the engineering approach that I'm advocating in this presentation. I asked lots of questions. I looked for doctrine that would stand and not fall down. I was looking for truth. I obtained many, many answers. Many of those answers do not conform to what the church teaches and is therefore not liked by the church, but that's not my point. I've read the book, the Bible, the Old Testament more than 20 times, the New Testament many more times, in numerous translations. I would suggest that I know the Bible better than most people. And I'm totally convinced that my faith and my belief must fit the facts. It must stand up to the most rigorous engineering scrutiny, and I'm sure you would agree with me. I would like to reference a fundamental law of physics. Force equals mass multiplied by acceleration. Any change in state, any movement relative to an apparently static position requires an external force. Disruption of the surface of the earth requires an external force. It cannot happen within a state of equilibrium on the planet. All evidence of dramatic change is also evidence of dramatic forces being applied. Evidence of a vertical up or down thrust of the surface of the earth is evidence of massive forces being applied. The nature of such a displacement is such that the force is almost certainly external. I would like to point out to you today, ladies and gentlemen, that we live in an unstable universe. As I was preparing this presentation, I had the privilege of having access to the NASA website and to a feed which puts up a photograph every day from the NASA collection of photographs. Many of those are space scenes. And so I'm going to share a few of those which I believe help to make this point. In front of you, you have a picture of a solar flare on the surface of our sun. Notice the scale of that flare relative to the surface of the sun, and recognize that as much as the sun looks stable and uniform to us from where we sit on planet Earth, it is in fact not nearly as stable as we would like to think. Another photograph, the sun on the 1st of August 2010. Look at all the instability, look at all the solar flares and all the movements taking place on the surface of the sun. Going far beyond our solar system, Hubble Space Telescope, looking at the birth of stars. The brown glob of stuff in the middle of the picture is actually clouds of gas, 3 light years high, huge, huge scale. And the bright lights dotted around that picture are all suns, numerous suns. And what we see there is this huge mass of gaseous and other material moving and shaping constantly. Again, showing just how unstable our universe is. Another example, another NASA photograph, a massive runaway star traveling at 400,000 kilometers per hour, equivalent to traveling from the Earth to the Moon in 1 hour. And you see scattered around in these clouds of gas and murk, millions and millions of stars, bigger, many cases bigger than our own star. And so the scale is absolutely huge, and the evidence of instability is mind-boggling. Another example, constellation Cassiopeia, a supernova, a massive explosion, a big red blob in the top left-hand corner of the image. Again, millions of stars. We are a micro element of the entire universe, and yet somehow we speculate that we know the full details of what's going on. But the point about the supernova, it's a massive explosion, again, an unstable universe. Coming closer to home, only 160 times further than the moon, Comet Lulin, described as a dirty snowball, a big glob of ice and gas traveling through space at high speed. Again, notice all the stars in the background. What if one of those hit the Earth or came close to the Earth? And then we find, just at the perimeter of our solar system, the Kuiper Belt, massive chunks of ice in space circulating. It's not difficult to postulate one of those being knocked out of its orbit by some space phenomenon and catapulting towards the Earth. Coming closer to home again with Mars, Hellas Planitia, a massive crater, 2,250 kilometers in diameter on the surface of Mars. And I ask you to notice some interesting things. The depth of the crater is limited, and the height of the crater walls is also limited. Now, if this had been a solid mass of rock that impacted, I suggest for your consideration the crater would look different. There would either be this big chunk of rock embedded in the surface of Mars, or the hole would be much deeper and the material thrown up would have a different characteristic. Stop, think about it. How did this crater get formed? I suggest for your consideration that it can only have been formed by an ice object which melted as it made impact with the surface of Mars. If we take that crater and superimpose it on southern Africa, it stretches from Cape Town to Lusaka, distance of over 2,000 kilometers. It totally obliterates the entire subcontinent where I've lived my entire life. It's thought-provoking. What if something like that hit the Earth at some time in the past? Would it just hit the Earth? Or would it do something like knocking the Earth out of its orbit, knocking it off its axis, do something else? So we live in an unstable universe. We're faced with massive instability in the environment around us, and the fact that we think we've had approximate instability for the last few thousand years does not mean that we have a basis to extrapolate over millions or billions of years. We see planets or stars or chunks of rock traveling at 400,000 kilometers an hour. We see massive chunks of ice 80 kilometers in diameter and larger. Instant floods are potentially real. We see massive sunspots. We see huge impact craters. Ladies and gentlemen, any assumption of steady state for millions of years is seriously open to question. So what if the crater on Mars was caused by a massive ice block? What if such an ice block hit the Earth? We're looking at 4.47 thousand million cubic meters of water. The Earth's diameter is only 12,700 kilometers. That amount of ice would result in a covering of the Earth of 11.75 kilometers deep. So in actual fact, a global flood could be caused by an ice object much smaller than that, striking the Earth. A depth of water of 2 kilometers only requires an object of 1,250 kilometers in diameter, or we could see a series of smaller objects. Coming right back to the Earth, we live on an unstable planet. There are currently about 500 active volcanoes around the world, as shown in this map from the United States Geological Survey. And it is estimated at one time there were about 20,000 volcanoes. How can we assume steady state for millions of years? I would like to introduce you to Johannesburg, my hometown, built on the gold of the Witwatersrand, or the White Waters Ridge, approximately 1,700 meters above sea level, and the source of much of the information on which this presentation builds its case. My point, ladies and gentlemen, is that I'm going to talk to you based on first-hand experience. This is not theory that I've read in a book. Bits of it, yes, I have read in a book, but I've tested them against the area where I live, and I really, really believe that you will find similar stuff in your area. As a height benchmark, I've chosen to use the Hillbrow Tower, one of the tallest buildings in Johannesburg at 269 meters. Quite small compared to the World Trade Center, the Empire State Building, but just a benchmark for height and depth for use in this presentation. Contrast that with the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, which stands at 828 meters, over 3 times the height of the Hillbrow Tower. And what I would ask you to see, that as we look at sedimentary deposits, water-laid rock, that the depth dwarfs the height of these buildings. The magnitude of what we're talking about is considerable. Coming really close to home, Northcliffe, which I see every time I drive home from pretty much any direction. It's a major landmark in Johannesburg. It's visible from the east, the north, and the west of Johannesburg for very many kilometers. It's an extension of the gold-bearing sedimentary rocks that form the Gold Reef, and as I've said, it's within a few kilometers of where I live. It's the pivot point for this presentation because it sums up the argument in one photograph. Northcliffe is made of vitrified quartzite rocks, that's sand melted in a furnace effectively. It dips 30 degrees south, and the same geological formation is continued 50 kilometers north in the Magaliesberg. Northcliffe is underlain by and upthrust by the Halfway House Granite Dome. Its high point is 1,807 meters above sea level, which is roughly the same level of high points for hundreds of kilometers around. There are no high points higher than this in the vicinity. It overlooks valleys cut down into the granite with material that has been deposited nearly 1,000 kilometers away. We have a cliff face with massive boulders wrenched out. The top of the hill is covered with rough, freestanding rocks. As I say, it's a graphic summary of this presentation. In considering what follows, I ask you to be critical. I ask you to take time to digest what I present. What follows is highly controversial. It turns many widely held theories on their head. It requires a major rethink if you accept what is presented. So I ask you not to take snap decisions for or against what I have to say. Weigh up the evidence and make a considered decision. Look around as you travel and see whether what is proposed here explains the topography and geology elsewhere in the world where you live. I am confident that the interpretation postulated here is valid, valuable, and an accurate interpretation of key elements of terrain formation and, by extension, history. I would ask you to notice about the demolition that you have just seen. That building collapsed almost instantaneously. It is so that dramatic, catastrophic change happens in very short periods of time. Think about reports of floods, volcanoes, hurricanes, typhoons. Any dramatic change, earthquakes, that you have heard of or encountered in your life. It happens rapidly, at a snap of the fingers. It doesn't happen gradually over millions or billions of years. That building did not fall down one grain of concrete at a time. It just totally collapsed. And I ask you to keep that in mind when you are evaluating theories of the formation of the earth with such evidence of catastrophic events, as I will show you in the slides that follow. To sum up this section of this presentation, whatever theory you adopt must be absolutely reliable and withstand all reasonable criticism. It must be practical. It must be possible to validate it against any situation you can personally identify. You should not abdicate your intellect in order to adopt it. I can name 100-1,000 eminent geologists, archaeologists, zoologists who will disagree with you. It's really not a valid argument against what is presented here. This is wacko. Is also not a valid argument against what is presented here. Don't allow yourself to be intimidated. Exercise your intellect. Look critically at what is presented and form your own opinions. Following on from this, we will look at the geology of South African gold mines. We will look at layered sedimentary rock around the world. We will look at the Halfway House Granite Dome and other domes. We will look at the African erosion surface. We will look at the incised valleys. And then we'll talk about when this happened and ask the question, why are we here? Are these things signs of judgment, or did they just happen? Where did the water come from? Where did it go? You need to think outside the box. And then we'll sum up and look at comprehensive evidence of a global flood and end by asking the question, where will you spend eternity? So in closing, I would ask you to ensure that your theory of topographic formation and the history of the earth is like a bridge and will stand up and not fall down because you have subjected it to critical examination.
Well, there you have it, some background. Let's take this further. Johannesburg is synonymous with gold mining. In the Witwatersrand area, which centers around Johannesburg, are the deepest and largest gold mines in the world. Johannesburg was founded as a mining camp for gold mining. The Witwatersrand, or the Ridge of White Waters, is where the gold was originally found. The gold is found in steeply dipping metamorphosed, that means rock that has been transformed from sedimentary mud and slush and sand to hard rock by heat. The gold is found in metamorphosed rocks which dip at about 30 degrees to the south from Johannesburg, and then in an arc east and west and south. That rock evidences a massive depth of water-deposited sediments that extend over hundreds of kilometers. That rock has been formed by pressure and heat, transforming mud and sand deposits and conglomerate beds into hard rock. This piece of geology around Johannesburg is one of the most intensively understood geologies around the world. The density of mines in this area is amazing. And everything about those mines evidences what I'm going to show you. So now I'm going to take you through some information about the South African gold mining industry. We're going to go down a gold mine. I'm going to fill you in on the first piece of key evidence on which my case is based.
Gold mining is a precision industry. As you've already seen, the gold is extracted from thin veins. It is subject, the ore is subject to precise chemical processes to extract the gold, and the gold is so scarce and so rare that it is only used in high-value applications such as jewelry and computer electronic circuits. The scale of the gold mines is huge, as indicated by the size of the machines in the pictures, and so is the scale of the deposits. As I've mentioned, the gold is in thin veins. The concentration of gold is measured in grams per ton. It's a minute concentration. Locating the gold is a major activity because the gold is very difficult to find. The ore is crushed finely and the gold is then extracted with chemical processes. The deepest gold mine is over 3.9 kilometers deep. That's 14.5 times the height of the Hillbrow Tower, or 4.7 times the height of the Burj Khalifa. That's 2 kilometers below sea level. It's important to note that the gold occurs in the same geological formation as Northcliffe in the south and the Magaliesberg in the north. In the south, the strata dip off to the south as indicated in the photographs on the left, and then strangely on the north, in the Magaliesberg, the same strata dip to the north. The gold is found in hard metamorphosed rock. You can see a typical stope mining area on the left and a piece of outcrop quartzite rock on the top of Northcliffe on the right. It is extremely hard and it has a semi-glassy appearance. As mentioned, these ore bodies, although they were deposited horizontally, now dip at about 30 degrees, and you see here a cross-section of a typical gold mine showing how the reef is accessed and extracted. Here we see a few photographs taken down a gold mine, and you can see the sloping characteristic of the roof of the excavation. The question is, how did it get to slope at that angle? Looking at the surface of the surface geology around the Witwatersrand, you will notice that it is extremely complex and that there's evidence of great contortion and disruption with all the different types of rock, as you can see in the map in front of you. Drilling down to the gold fields themselves, again you find that there's no uniformity. The concentrations of gold are distributed at various locations, and again there's great diversity in the geology. Looking at a cross-section, we see the rock dipping at about 30 degrees, but you'll notice a few other key points. First of all, the shifts vertically up and down all over the place, shown by the black lines, the faulting, showing that the surface of the earth after the horizontal deposition, after the tilting, was subject to huge vertical displacements. And then a further interesting phenomenon, the top of that material has been chopped off, and there's other material laid down horizontally on top of it. Looking at the stratigraphic column, a vertical section through the gold-bearing rock, we see that the sedimentary rocks are about 2 kilometers in vertical height. Consider the body of water in which had to exist for this material to be deposited so uniformly, and also the body of water that was necessary to remove material to this depth to create what you see in front of you. And then consider that the deepest mines are close to 4 kilometers, 2 kilometers below current sea level. This had to require a very large body of water in terms of depth, extent, and erosion sources. It's not a stream deposited formation or delta on the side of an inland sea. This requires a very large inland sea, or in fact a very large sea. The uniform deposition implies that there was a uniform sea, and it also implies high velocity deposition. Schematically, what we see is the 2 kilometer thick bedding of sedimentary rock, originally horizontal, upthrust by the halfway house granite dome of molten rock and extending below sea level. Try and imagine the forces that were necessary to create what you see in front of you. To sum up, we find ourselves with huge depth and extent of sedimentary materials, originally horizontally deposited but now sloping steeply. We find massive faulting. This can only have resulted from deposition in water over a large area and then subject to intense pressure and temperature. Where did it come from? How did it happen?
So now we've seen that the gold mining industry is based on these massive depths of heavily inclined sedimentary rocks that have been metamorphosed by heat and pressure. But there's something interesting about that, because these are not the only sedimentary rocks. If we jump 50 or so kilometers north, we find the same sequence of rocks diving into the north as part of the Witwatersrand system. And that's another discussion about where has the bit in the middle gone to. But right now I want to concentrate on these sedimentary layers. Because what we will find is if we go to Table Mountain in Cape Town, the mountain is horizontal and made up of horizontal layers, the ends of which have disappeared. If we go to KwaZulu-Natal, the so-called Drakensberg, the mountain of dragons, because of the shape, we find horizontal massive basalt underlain by sedimentary rocks, again jutting out into nowhere. We find the same in the Lowveld of Mpumalanga and Limpopo. And in fact, as you travel the world, you will find sedimentary deposits, metamorphosed sedimentary deposits, and just straightforward sedimentary deposits all over the world. All of them speaking of huge volumes of water moving huge masses of material and depositing them out to huge extent. One of these could be explained by a local, very large inland sea, as some have tried. But I want to suggest for your consideration in the footage that follows, the possibility that in actual fact the entire Earth was submerged and layers like this exist all over the planet.
As I've just mentioned, sedimentary rocks are widely occurring. We're accustomed to beautiful mountain scenes, but how often do you look at the stratification of the mountains as you see in the photograph in front of you? I'd like to come back to Northcliffe, the pivot point of this whole presentation, again made up of originally horizontally bedded, metamorphosed sedimentary rocks. And as I go forward, I'll show you the geological map of South Africa and position the individual photographs to give you some feel as just how widely distributed sedimentary rocks are, first in South Africa and then in the world. Table Mountain, as we've already seen, made up of horizontal layers right down in the south. Cathedral Peak in the Natal Drakensberg, horizontal layers over massive extent on the border of Lesotho. The Stormberg, Berkeley East in the Eastern Cape. Notice the strange erosion formations, but more importantly notice the substantial horizontally bedded rocks. South of Lesotho. The Hex River Mountains in the Western Cape, massively contorted but originally horizontal layers. Cape Point, the very tip of Africa. Notice how the horizontal layers jut into the sea, and notwithstanding the force of the waves, have stood there for considerable time. The Cedarburg Kloof and Michalisburg, again notice the strange erosion patterns, but also notice the horizontally bedded or near horizontally bedded layers. The Drakensberg near Clarence in the Orange Free State, massive horizontal layers again. Alberton, south of Johannesburg, the same formations as Northcliffe. In the Limpopo province, the Blyde River Canyon. And in the Fish River Canyon in Namibia, notice the massive extent of these horizontally bedded rocks and the interesting erosion forms. And so we see that throughout South Africa, we find the occurrence of sedimentary rocks, metamorphosed sedimentary rocks. And then we see the Karoo Sedimentary Basin covers a large part of the country, which is in itself a specific sedimentary deposit. And there are many other places in South Africa. Traveling further afield, the Victoria Falls in Zimbabwe, we find horizontal layers into which have been gouged a canyon, which is now static. We see the same phenomenon of the Niagara Falls on the border between the United States and Canada. In the Corinth Canal in Greece, massive horizontally bedded layers. The Grand Canyon in the United States, even more dramatic than the Fish River Canyon. Karnataka in India. Ayers Rock in Australia, massive horizontally bedded layers, and again notice that the ends have disappeared. The Shetland Islands. And then if we go to the Gulf of Mexico, we find the deepest oil well in the world, 10,000 meters below the surface. That's 10,000 meters of sedimentary deposits, at the bottom of which are massive accumulations of organic matter which have been subject to intense heat and pressure and converted into oil and gas. And so we see wherever we go in the world, sedimentary layers. The New World Encyclopedia says that the continental crust is composed primarily of sedimentary rocks. And if we conclude that the entire planet is covered with sedimentary rocks, then surely we must conclude that at some stage the entire planet was covered with water. Wikipedia says that the sedimentary rocks are a thin veneer on the surface of the earth. So something has happened, that while deep down we have igneous, that is, rocks formed from molten core material, on the surface we have this thin veneer of sedimentary rocks which must have been formed by water. How did that happen? Where did the water come from? There's no evidence of a basin or edge deposits. The basins that are postulated by some overlap horizontally and vertically. The depths run to as much as 10,000 meters. The magnitude of material is consistent with a global hydraulic event or flood or inundation with a global sea. We find great uniformity in some areas, and then we find even coarser material in others, and in some cases we find that large boulders have been transported, as you'll see in the image in the bottom left-hand corner with my foot on the rock. We find volcanic pipes with no volcano. On the left we see a cross-section of a volcano, but the entire cone above ground level has been cut off, as in Finch Mine on the right-hand side. Sedimentary rocks have been frequently, but not always, metamorphosed. They're sometimes associated with large waterfalls, and perhaps you might find that there are massive sedimentary deposits at a site near you, or perhaps all around where you live, wherever you are in the world. From these photographs of a storm event at Port Elizabeth in South Africa, we see how substantial wave action can move massive chunks of stone, as you can see on the right-hand side. Look at the big piece of concrete in the foreground. And so dramatic water forces are capable of moving things in dramatic ways. So to sum up, we find that there are huge areas of sedimentary rock in the world, that these deposits required massive water extent, depth and velocity. The fact that many of these layers have been compressed and converted to hard rock indicates that at some stage they were overlain with massive amounts of material that's disappeared. This is not a small local inland sea or even a large one. I suggest for your consideration that a massive global hydraulic event is the only plausible explanation. But then we have to say, where did the water come from and where has it gone? And just because we can't necessarily imagine where it's come from or where it's gone doesn't mean it wasn't there. And then we need to ask the question, does it matter?
Returning to the Witwatersrand, including the Magaliesberg, the range to the north that I spoke of a short while ago, we find ourselves with this phenomenon. To the south, those rocks dip off about 30 degrees. To the north, they dip off about 30 degrees, and in the middle, there's a gap. There's no dispute that those rocks were originally horizontal layers. How did they get to be broken in the middle like that? Well, it happens that between the Witwatersrand and the Magaliesberg, you will find the Halfway House Granite Dome. The Halfway House Granite Dome is a massive glob of granite which in its molten state thrust up and arched up the horizontal strata. The heat from the granite baking and converting the mud and sand deposits into hard rock, such as we've already seen. I will show you now more information about how that happened and what it looks like in practice.
In considering this section, it's important to recognize that the Earth has a molten core, and as shown in the image, that in cases that core has thrust up to the surface, and in fact in some occasions has actually broken out on the surface. What is a dome? It's a massive granite intrusion. In the photographs you'll see a few examples of granite domes, and it's important to recognize that when those domes were upthrust, they were clearly upthrust into surrounding material which contained them, otherwise they would have flowed out horizontally. And the discussion of where that material has gone will be reserved for a later section. Zooming in on the Witwatersrand again, we see the pink circle or circular area representing the outcrop of the Halfway House Granite Dome with Northcliffe on its southern boundary. Here we see roughly what that looks like. The granite dome thrusting up, bending the horizontally bedded layers containing the gold, and at the same time the heat from the granite metamorphosing that into glassy quartzite. The total upthrust probably represents a vertical displacement of about 7 kilometers. In considering this, it's important to recognize that when molten or liquid material freezes or solidifies, it does so from the outside in. And therefore it's reasonable to postulate that at the point in history when this happened, the Earth had a much thinner crust than it has today. This is demonstrated by the example here of a body of water in a plastic vessel, frozen in a refrigerator and then removed while it was freezing, so that you can see the thin skin that formed. And the longer you leave it in the freezer, the thicker that shell will become. And that's very much what's happening with the crust of the Earth from day to day. Dr. Robert Gentry presents research that evidences that the granite rocks on the surface of the Earth cooled rapidly, which is consistent with the above explanation. It's consistent with molten rock being upthrust into cold, wet material that has been deposited by cold seas, and where evaporation results in rapid cooling.
Many theories attempt to picture just how and when our planet was formed. But until recently, there's been little hard evidence to go by. Now, however, a new discovery has thrust before the world a revolutionary model of our origins, forcing many scientists to consider the unthinkable. The startling new evidence is found deep beneath the Earth, below layers of sedimentary rock down in its primordial stones, the granites. There, tiny bits of radioactive matter have formed what scientists call radiohalos. They've left telltale traces, creating a discolored sphere around them. Scientists can identify precisely what kind of material caused these radiohalos by measuring their sizes. One U.S. scientist, Dr. Robert Gentry, has examined more than 100,000 of these phenomena. Dr. Gentry has discovered a type of radiohalo that just shouldn't be there. In fact, according to every basic principle of evolutionary theory, it just can't be there. It's impossible. But after years of vigorous experimenting and testing, there is now no doubt.
I have identified polonium radiohalos in the Earth's basement granites from America, Canada, Scandinavia, Europe, Russia, Japan, and Madagascar. This is extraordinary because these polonium isotopes have a very fleeting existence. One type I've identified, polonium-218, occurs for only a few minutes before decaying into something else. And yet this radioactive element has imprinted its identifying halo in solid granite, in particular in these pieces from the White Mountains in New Hampshire and from Neji in Japan. In granite, halos are found in this dark mineral called mica. The mica must be thinly sliced or peeled with tape and then mounted on a glass slide before halos can be observed. Animation helps us to understand the origin of the three-ring polonium-218 halo now seen under the microscope. The three sunburst patterns shooting out from the tiny center represent three different energy nuclear particles that were successively ejected from three different isotopes of polonium encased within the tiny center. The accumulated effects of millions of such particles discolored the mineral around the center, thus producing three microscopic-sized, concentric colored spheres. In the mineral, the halo is always three-dimensional. Under the microscope, however, it looks flat. By taking a thin slice of the mineral through the center, we have effectively cut off the top and the bottom of the spheres and are thus left to view the halo as a series of three concentric rings under the microscope, as is illustrated in this animation sequence. According to all present scientific theories, granites, such as this specimen from Pikes Peak in Colorado, originated in a molten state, cooled, crystallized, and hardened over millions of years deep in the earth. But if that's the case, the radioactivity produced by polonium would never have been captured. it would have decayed away long before the rock solidified. The grains of polonium that made these radio halos were embedded deep in the granite. The element was there somehow when the rock was formed, but it could only form its radio halo after the rock had already hardened. And if polonium exists for only a few seconds or minutes, the implication has stunned all those who are willing to listen. Polonium radio halos indicate that the Earth's foundation rocks, the granites, were formed almost instantly. In fact, they are evidence that the granites had to be formed instantly. Scientifically, they cannot be accounted for in any other way.
Returning to South Africa, we find that around the Halfway House Dome, we find 30-degree slopes. Northcliffe dipping 30 degrees to the south, the Magaliesberg in the north dipping 30 degrees to the north, and on the west, in Kloofendal, dipping 30 degrees to the west. What you have just seen is the shattering or breaking of a ceramic tile which is of similar hardness to the quartzite rock of the Witwatersrand. It will be apparent from that example that the rock was not formed in its quartzite state at the time that the dome upthrust, otherwise there would have been massive shattering. We see the same with the thin slab of ice.
Again.
With thicker ice, it doesn't break at all. And so if the depth of the sedimentary rocks in a solid quartzite state had been significant, they would have just been upthrust as slabs and the edges would have broken away.
Okay.
The alternative is that the rock would have cracked open, but if that was so, the cracks would have opened up and mining would be impossible because of the fractured nature. So again, it is apparent that the rock did not crack as the dome thrust up. Here we see another photo of the same piece of curved wood showing how the cracks open up. Conversely, using a piece of window putty, it is apparent that it is easy for soft, newly deposited sand and mud to conform to the shape of the dome. Here we see the same window putty turned on upside down to more accurately or more easily evidence the curved shape that has been taken on. So the quartzite is evidence of intense heat. The ceramic tile is fired in an oven at considerable temperature, and so it must be that the quartzite rock was also subject to considerable temperature. But then we find that following the formation of the dome itself is intersected with dikes and faults. At the bottom of the screen we see the Rand Park Ridge Mylonite dike, which is a substantial intrusion of other rock into the granite. On the left we find dolerite near that. And throughout the dome there are intrusions of dolerite and mylonite and other rocks and faulting, indicating that not only was there massive disruption at the time that the dome intruded, but after the formation of the dome there was further massive surface disruption. The scale is huge, about 50 kilometers in diameter at the surface. The vertical displacement of the top of the dome is at least 7,000 meters based on the lowest levels of the gold-bearing ore, and it could be considerably more. The sedimentary deposits were converted to extremely hard vitreous ceramic quartzite, and this had to happen quickly before the granite solidified or froze. The disruption of the surface of the earth is staggering. How could something like this happen? Will it happen again?
So we've seen how this dome was formed. We've seen that at some point in the past, those layers followed the contour of the dome. There's a further challenge. What's happened to that dome? The top has been cut off. And as I will now show you, and as you've seen momentarily in the footage so far, it's like the top has been cut off with a knife. That flat surface can be seen from high points for hundreds of kilometers around Johannesburg, and although I've not personally witnessed it, I'm told it extends all the way to Zimbabwe, a distance of more than 1,000 kilometers. I've done some investigation around the immediate vicinity of Johannesburg, the Witwatersrand, Magaliesburg, and find that there are spot heights all over the place of 1,700 meters to 1,800 meters at a level of uniformity that is mind-boggling from an engineering point of view if this level plain formed over millions of years by things settling and moving and what have you. If you have ever tried to cast a horizontal concrete slab, hang a door vertical and plumb, ice the top of a cake flat, or produce anything else of uniformity and level, you will know how mechanically difficult it is to do that. Imagine how difficult it is to have a plane which extends for hundreds of kilometers, 2,000 meters up in the air, or above sea level. I'm going to show you the evidence which suggests that that could only be done by a massive tsunami, a massive tidal wave, extending across the entire planet, scything around and around and around, chopping off layer after layer to produce a level surface that is almost exactly parallel with the sea surface.
This surface is called the African erosion surface. It's a massive flat plain. It's well documented, as we can see on the internet in Google. We see a publication of the Geological Society of America on the African erosion surface. 1,980,000 exact matches in Google. Considerable technical literature. And it's vital to understanding the full impact of this presentation. How did it happen? Here we see from a atlas, the mid-brown area all over southern Africa represents this African erosion surface, this flat plain. Looking north from Northcliffe, we find that the horizon is remarkably uniform and level. There are no mountains that stand out. We find these same panorama characteristics all over the Witwatersrand. And so we see there the range of the view roughly from Northcliffe. Looking south from Northcliffe, we see the same basic attributes, although a little bit masked by the presence of the city of Johannesburg. Further north from the Grand Central Airport Control Tower, a 360-degree view, we notice the same uniform horizon with slight curvature representing the curvature of the Earth there in the panorama of photographs. East of Costa in the Northwest Province, we find exactly the same. Traveling over to Krugersdorp, we find the same with the exception of the hill towards the left of the picture, but the reality is, as you will see from the right of the picture, this photograph was not taken at the absolute highest point, and if it were, that peak would also be level with the surrounding peaks. And so it doesn't matter where you travel around the Witwatersrand, and in fact, many kilometers from the Witwatersrand, you find the same phenomenon of uniform panoramas. Returning to Northcliffe on the Geological Survey 1 in 50,000 map, we find that the spot height on Northcliffe is 1,807 meters above sea level, and we notice that around that there are a significant number of heights in the range 1,700 to 1,800 meters. Drilling in, we find that several kilometers away is another high point, only 2.3% lower than Northcliffe. Moving to the east, around Observatory, we find a spot height of 1,809 meters, 2 meters different from Northcliffe, but more than 10 kilometers away. From an engineering point of view, that is a remarkable feat. It would be extremely difficult in human terms to construct something with that level of precision over that distance. Notice again a number of heights between 1,700 and 1,800 meters. Drilling in, we find a number of points very close in height to Northcliffe. Going north to Hekpoort, we find the Nooitgedacht Ridge, 1,852 meters, 45 meters higher than Northcliffe, but 50 kilometers away. A remarkable challenge in creating uniformity, and we find in the immediate vicinity a number of spot heights close to one another. Traveling to Grand Central, we find a little bit lower. Around Benoni, the Joburg Airport, also a little bit lower. Going west to Randfontein, also fairly close. And then going to Suikerbosrand, we find a 5% variation, just under 100 meters higher at the high point. Suikerbosrand is the watershed of the entire central Witwatersrand, Gauteng area. And so we find, over a distance of about 100 kilometers, a variation of the order of 100 meters. A remarkable feat of engineering if this was to be done in human terms. So we find small high point variation in the Johannesburg area. We find limited high point variation over Gauteng. We find this level surface visible from all high points in the area, confirming the African erosion surface. It's a feat of engineering and very difficult to do in practice, and it's not possible to happen randomly over millions of years. It requires an overall grading mechanism to produce such a widespread level surface. If we consider the art of plane and level, we live in a man-made world where we take vertical and horizontal plumb for granted, and yet it requires feats of engineering and human precision to produce absolutely level slabs. It even requires some skill to produce a level top to a wedding cake. It requires special tools to make precise furniture. And in the background, in ways that many people are unaware of, precise machines are used to produce precisely level surfaces, as in the case of this road grader where the long wheel span provides the mechanics to produce a uniform and level surface. We've seen already that massive wave action can move huge amounts of material, but you'll notice from the photographs that the displacement is all over the place, a function of the individual wave forces. But what if we had uniform waves? Consider the possibility, how do we get this uniform surface? Consider the possibility of a massive tidal wave ripping around the planet, chopping off layer after layer, and producing this uniform surface. As an engineer, I can see no other explanation. There's the only way that we can explain this uniformity over thousands of kilometers. It's only massive water action that has the capacity to cut down this level of material and to cut the top off the halfway house granite dome and the sedimentary layers upthrust by the dome, including the extremely hard rock that we've seen. Please reflect on your own practical life experience and knowledge. What else can explain the topographic forms, the landforms that we see around us? Please don't abdicate your intellect. Check this theory out for yourself as you drive around and look at travel books. So to sum up, we have a massive flat plain, level with the sea level, but we cannot see the sea. Nearly 2,000 meters above sea level. From a technical point of view, it seems impossible. And I suggest for your consideration that it cannot possibly have occurred slowly over millions of years. It's too uniform. What caused it? There is no reasonable explanation apart from massive global wave and water action. How could that occur? Where's the water gone? And for that matter, where did it come from? So some conclusions thus far. We live in an unstable universe with runaway stars, massive planetary impacts, massive ice blocks in space. We have sedimentary deposits over thousands of kilometers and to depths in excess of 10,000 meters. These can only have been eroded and deposited by massive hydraulic action, consistent with a global flood. We have massive igneous intrusions consistent with a thin crust and massive crustal disruption due to an external force. We have massive erosion of upthrust material to give a level plain over thousands of kilometers, which can only be explained by massive hydraulic action consistent with a global sea and massive tidal waves.
So we've seen the gold fields, the dipping hard rock going thousands of meters below the surface. We've seen the dome, which suggests that those same strata once projected at least 1,000 meters above the present ground surface. And we've seen that it's been chopped off. But now there's an added complexity. You may have noticed from the photographs that I've shown you just now that the plain is not just a plain. Incised into the plain are gently undulating valleys and hills. The top of the hills never going above that critical 1,700 to 1,800 meters above sea level. How did that happen? In the section that follows, I'm going to evidence to you that that can only have been the result of a massive hydraulic drainage event that scoured out rock in huge quantities at huge velocities beyond anything that we can comprehend, because it is so, from an engineering point of view, that dramatic, catastrophic change happens in very short spaces of time with huge forces, not gradually over millions or hundreds of millions of years.
Let's have a look at what the remaining surface of the dome actually evidences. In front of you, you have a computer-generated digital terrain model of the surface of the Witwatersrand. In the north, you see, to the top of the picture, you see the Magaliesberg, with the cliffs facing south, and to the south you have the ridges of the Witwatersrand. What you will notice is that not only have we got the level surface on the horizon that we saw previously, but interspersed with that the valleys that have been cut into that level surface. Here we have a river valley in the Halfway House Granite Dome, and what you will notice is that it is a very, very flat valley and that the stream in the middle is very small. Going to Craig Hall, we see the same phenomenon. I grew up less than a kilometer from this point, and I've seen the river in flood many times, but very seldom does it go above the immediate banks that you see in the center of the picture. Very seldom does it flood the electricity pylons. There is absolutely no way that that little stream could have eroded this huge valley. We find that these streams do not even have the capacity to erode the rocks in the riverbed. On the left we see a photograph of an erosion channel which shows how a narrow flow of water cuts a deep, narrow gorge, not a big, wide valley. It's important to recognize that gentle rain does nothing to the topography. It just waters the plants. We could run those sprinklers for millions of years and all we would have would be lush foliage. It is high-velocity water that erodes material. We can see there the amount of material removed very quickly with that high-pressure water jet. On the right we see an example of hydraulic mining, very high-pressure water used to very rapidly cut down and erode huge volumes of material. High-velocity water has enormous capacity to cut and transport material. We then find ourselves with some other interesting phenomenon. If we get up close to Northcliffe or the Magaliesberg, we find these near vertical cliff faces in hard, intensely hard rock, with huge chunks of rock just plucked out of those cliff faces, leaving ragged edges on the cliff face. What forces were required to pluck those rocks out, and where have the rocks gone to? We're looking at huge volumes of material here. To complicate matters even further, when we get on top of the hills, we find huge chunks of jagged, sharp rock just left behind. Presumably the rock in between has gone somewhere. They're a continuation of the strata. If we travel to Cape Town, we find the same phenomenon, a near vertical cliff face with massive chunks of rock plucked out and on top of the mountain. Huge chunks of rugged, ragged rock left behind by something. How do we explain this? If we look at Northcliffe, we find a drop of 300 meters vertically over 3 kilometers. If we look at the entire Halfway House Granite Dome, at a rough estimate, about 600 cubic kilometers of rock and earth have been removed. That's 600,000 million cubic meters. The river flow is downhill all the way to the low ground of the Limpopo province, about 1,000 kilometers. And all that material was removed through the Hartbeespoort Gorge. The only possible explanation is massive high-velocity water flows as being the mechanical means to move this material. If we look at the flow characteristics and the erosion characteristics of stream flows, we find that it is exponential, and that the faster the flow of water, the greater the capacity. What happens at high velocities beyond anything we've ever experienced on Earth? Looking there, we see the path that the material has to have followed out through the Hartbeespoort Gorge all the way down to the Lowveld of Limpopo and possibly into the Mozambique Channel. A huge distance through one gorge. It's the only possible explanation as to where all this material has gone to. Somebody said to me, could this have been caused by glacier action? The answer is no. On the bottom right we see the valleys in the area we're talking about. On the top right we see a valley caused by a glacier similar to that on the left. Glaciers are characterized by U-shaped valleys, very different from what we have here.
Okay.
We clearly see here that water evaporates and rock doesn't, and I suggest for your consideration that your whole life experience tells you that rock does not evaporate. It is so that if you subjected rock to such high temperatures that it became molten, it might sublimate at some level that's but in general, rock does not evaporate. Could the rock have dissolved? Well, you clearly see from that example, sugar dissolves, but rock doesn't. Your whole life experience will tell you that you do not expect rock to dissolve. If we look at the erosion of valleys, if there's a limited bed load, the result will be a narrow valley with steep sides, as you see on the right. In order to produce the wide flat valleys that we see in the Witwatersrand area, it's necessary for there to have been a large bed load, as demonstrated in the diagram at the bottom. It's a huge problem to explain. The rock was not removed by ice, it didn't evaporate, it did not dissolve. It can only have been eroded by massive water suction resulting from high velocity, and I suggest for your consideration, coupled with boiling water, as the only way that we can get these ragged hilltops. How could all of this happen? How could we get the volumes of water? Well, it so happens that there's a large body of information which indicates that all the continents once fitted together. Conventional theory says that they separated over millions or billions of years. But what if it happened rapidly, like all the other events discussed in this presentation? Continental separation requires massive forces to split the continents, massive forces to overcome the inertia of these massive continents and start movement, and then massive forces to stop the movement. This cannot happen in a steady state environment. It requires an external force. Imagine rapid separation of the continents. What if simultaneously the Earth expanded as a consequence of all the surface disruption breaking the crust, which would have contracted rapidly as a consequence of rapid cooling? What if several kilometers depth of water drained off the land in a very short space of time, perhaps days or weeks? What if the water flow had the erosive capacity to cause the topography that I've described, and the topography in the part of the world where you live? What if? Some theories. The conventional theory is that thermal convection of the Earth's core slowly over millions of years separated the continents. But what about the possibility of impact by a large object from space causing instability, or flyby of a large comet, a near miss? What about contraction of the crust causing cracking, or a combination of some of the above? If we look at the coefficient of thermal expansion, the ratio of change in length to length as a result of a change in temperature, we find that the coefficient of thermal expansion of granite is 6.5 micrometers per meter. That's millionths of a meter per meter at 20 degrees centigrade. The melting point of granite, as in the Halfway House Granite Dome, is 1,700 degrees centigrade. Cooling from molten to 0 degrees would shrink the circumference of the Earth by approximately 427 kilometers. Now, it is so that the whole Earth was not molten, but even a much smaller cooling would cause massive tension on the surface of the Earth because the core would not contract. So the possible source of the forces to split apart the continents is there. As the continents separate, we would see massive gorges forming and potentially water rushing off the continents, giving rise to massive erosion beyond anything we can visualize. Then we find that there are ocean trenches. The Mariana Trench near Japan is 11,000 meters deep. Seemingly concurrently with the continental separation, trenches were formed, which would provide a further vehicle for draining of the continents. It is so that the volume of the seas is 18 times more than the volume of the land, so it is easy to postulate rapid and dramatic drainage. Well, let's remember that we live in an unstable universe. Remember the example of the runaway star capable of traveling from the Earth to the Moon in 1 hour. What if something like that was to fly by the Earth, putting massive gravitational forces on the Earth? There are theories that the Earth's axis was once vertical, that the orbit around the Sun was circular and not elliptical, that a year was exactly 360 days instead of 365 and a quarter. And it seems absolutely possible that a large comet or other space object that exerted massive gravitational pull on the Earth could pull the Earth out of a circular orbit around the Sun and cause the Earth to tilt on its axis. One theory says close to 30 degrees originally. Why not? So we find large valleys incised in the dome and elsewhere all over the Earth. We see, like Table Mountain, the ends just disappeared. These valleys are too large to be formed by current streams. We find massive plucking of cliff faces and tops of hills all over the world. We see that the continents were originally one landmass. We see that thermal shrinkage of the crust due to cooling quite easily explains the splitting up of the continents, and we see that a massive flyby or impact of a space object tilting the Earth on its axis, thereby distorting its orbit around the Sun and causing massive shear hysteresis between the crust and the core, can explain the separation of the continents. All of this happened rapidly. It's mechanically impossible for it to happen slowly. How long ago did this happen?
So by now, I hope you are at least tentatively convinced that at some point in the history of this planet there was a massive hydraulic and tectonic event. That the surface of this Earth was mashed up in dramatic ways beyond anything that we normally think about. And that this all took place in conjunction with massive flooding. We haven't talked yet about how that happened. We'll get there a little bit later. But I want to step back for a minute. I said at the beginning of this video that I believe that there is a creator, and I believe that the Bible is a reasonably reliable historical account. Again, I'm not going to try and convince you that the whole book is inspired, because actually I don't believe that either. But I am going to suggest for your consideration right now that the passage in Genesis which speaks of a global flood is a reliable historical account. And then I want to show you a few other pieces of evidence. Chariot wheels on the floor of the Red Sea, just where Exodus says they will be found. The remains of a huge wooden ship which approximates the Genesis account of the ark that was built by a man called Noah. The remains of cities turned to ash by flaming sulfur balls from the sky in the locations assigned to Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities, also in Genesis. And I'm going to ask you to consider the possibility that at least at that level, the books of Genesis and Exodus are reasonably reliable historical account.
So we've identified that there's been a massive hydraulic and tectonic event. The question is now, how long ago did this take place? We've seen that each stage of what has been discussed happened rapidly. It's more likely to be weeks or months per stage rather than millions or billions of years. And then there's the added complexity. There are written records that suggest this happened as recently as 2345 before Christ. Other widely held opinions state that these events took place millions or billions of years ago. Which view is more reliable? We've looked at the exponential characteristics of erosive capacity, of the strength of rock, of all sorts of other physical attributes. And it's important to note that if we're talking about exponential characteristics, things might have happened in thousands of years, which a linear characteristic would say happened in millions of years. And then we find ourselves faced with the dilemma of what you might call the God's Word phenomenon. People who say the Bible is the Word of God and without error. The Bible says there was a flood. I believe the Bible. So that settles that there was a flood. But nowhere in the book does the Bible claim to be without error or to be the Word of God. It is a book containing a collection of historical records. And then we found a counter phenomenon which you might call "my teacher told me." Professor N told me there was no flood. This planet came into existence 4.55 billion years ago, plus or minus 1%. Everything happened gradually. There's nothing to discuss. But we have no way of knowing what happened millions of years ago. It's pure speculation. We must look at current practical facts. And then we find ourselves confronted with the problem of clean, sharp corners. All over the world we find clean rocks with sharp corners. Over millions or billions of years, these corners would be weathered and rounded by thermal stressing and covered with moss and lichen. So millions of years is improbable. Are there other indicators of age? We've referred previously to the mathematical and legal principle of reductio ad absurdum, reduced to the absurd, or proof by contradiction. And I'm going to make use of that in discussing a number of these theories. So let's look at the theory which says that this happened millions or billions of years ago. Well, fundamental to that theory is a statement that we know the radioactive decay rate of some mineral or other. And we have no basis to assume that there's been a nonlinear trend. Everything so far in this presentation indicates massively nonlinear events. We have written records going back thousands of years which indicate a recent event. So I want to suggest for your consideration that millions of years is therefore highly improbable, technically unsound, and logically probably absurd. Then we have the phenomenon of the Bible is the Word of God and without error. Can we reduce that to the absurd? Well, we can certainly say it's a collection of writings by assorted people. Nowhere in the book is there a passage that unambiguously catalogues the content of the book and defines its scope. There are books of the same name that have different compilations and literally hundreds of different English versions. The Catholic version is not the same as the Protestant version, is not the same as the Greek Orthodox version, is not the same as the Church of the East version, and so it goes. Nowhere in the book does it claim that the entire compendium of writings is without error. And nowhere in the book does it claim that the entire compendium of writings is, quote, the Word of God, or Yah, the true name of the Creator. So the inerrant Word of God, or Yah, is therefore highly improbable. But could Genesis be correct at some level? At this point, I suggest that the most we can say about the book, the Bible, is that it is a collection of writings, the oldest of them generally accepted to be at least 2,500 years old. The book claims that there was a global flood in about 2345 BC, or more correctly, the section of the book called Genesis makes that claim, and there are various subsequent references to it. At this stage, let us not get into whether the flood was an act of a being who is customarily referred to as God or the Lord, or even whether he exists or not. Let us simply say that Genesis claims there was a global flood, and examine that portion of that book further. See if we can reduce that to the absurd. Genesis is presented as an historical account of real events. Can we validate this? If we find minor errors, they're not a problem if we consider the writings to be the work of human beings who, like ourselves, make mistakes. Most specifically, can we regard reports of a global flood about 4,500 years ago as reliable? Well, Genesis refers to a flood. It also refers to a massive wooden boat of a length of about 150 meters, width 25 meters, and height 15 meters, which came to rest in the mountains of Ararat. Now it happens that the mountains of Ararat are in Turkey, and it also happens, as you can see from the photograph, that the remains of a ship of exactly those dimensions have been found in a mud flow on the mountains of Ararat in Turkey. And around that, various archaeological finds, including a house, and engravings which indicate that it was built by a family of 8 people, entirely consistent with the Genesis account. Here we see a computer model of the Ark based on the excavations and subsurface radar observations, and we see a model constructed based on what has been found. We also find drogue stones, and it's notable that Noah's house was found and that the house belonged to somebody about 6 meters tall. The grave was also found. So we can zoom in and find this ark. We can find it even in Google Earth. And we can position it exactly where Genesis says that it is to be found. So that seems to me to be pretty solid evidence that at least that part of Genesis has some substance in truth, even if it's not exact. We find also in Genesis genealogies which date the flood 1,658 years from the start of the genealogy. And then interestingly, we find Irish genealogies which date from Noah that correspond with the Genesis genealogies, at least in the first few generations. And it is reported that around the world other genealogies confirm that they all stem from a man called Noah or Nuh or similar. Careful examination of Egyptian timelines reveals that when we take account of the fact that different pharaohs lived concurrently and reigned concurrently in different parts of Egypt, that they agree with a date of the flood roughly 2345 before Christ or before Common Era, depending on your choice of language there. And it's interesting to note that it's doubtful whether we have the technology to build the Great Pyramid today. So there are indications of very advanced technological capability immediately after this flood. So we have a large boat in the mountains of Ararat, as reported in Genesis, confirmed. We have the genealogies confirmed. And so I suggest for your consideration it is absurd to disregard Genesis as a source of historical information, and therefore that we can say with some confidence that a recent flood is confirmed. Some references you might find interesting, which are available from us, or direct from Jonathan Gray: Killing of Paradise Planet, Surprise Witness, The Corpse Came Back, Before, During and After the Flood, Reconstruction Based on Archaeological Findings, Dead Men's Secrets, 1,000 archaeological findings that evidence that the civilization destroyed by the flood was far more sophisticated than our current civilization and had technologies we do not have today. There's various other materials available from us or from Jonathan Gray at the contact details that you see there. Jonathan Gray has written a number of books with regard to dating problems, why modern dating techniques give wrong results. Some very thought-provoking and interesting reading available also from us or from Jonathan. And then an added complication, evidence of a global nuclear war about 4,500 years ago, not long after the flood. Description which looks very similar to Hiroshima. A number of remains of highly radioactive cities around the world with similar destruction to that experienced at Hiroshima. Indications of nuclear bombs and nuclear war. Suggestions that Australopithecus and other missing link cavemen were in fact human beings born from parents subject to nuclear radiation and therefore deformed. Important to note that if there has been global nuclear war, then any assumption of steady-state nuclear decay is thrown into further disarray. So if we consider the possibility of total destruction of the surface of the earth by a flood less than 4,500 years ago, we find that many other theories are also disrupted. We see that global warming is a natural result of the earth continuing to dry out as water drains from the continents, and therefore so is the rising of sea levels, as shown by the graph bottom right. We find that cities have been submerged, and that those cities are available for inspection. We find that all races can trace their origin back to Noah and his family, and that all differences between race groups are a consequence of degradation, or if you like, negative evolution. We find that evolution over millions of years is invalid. And in fact, we find that it's possible that dinosaurs lived recently and the Loch Ness Monster was quite possibly real. So what is the origin and purpose of man? What is the truth about evolution versus creation? How do you evaluate that? Together with this DVD, there's a CD at the end of the set which contains a document entitled What is the Origin and Purpose of Man? Or you can download the document from my website at www.etimin.org. This document examines in some detail the relative merits of evolution versus creation. So an aside, what do I believe about the Bible? It's a highly valuable resource in coming to know the Creator at a personal level. The lack of certainty about the contents of the book has caused me to turn to him and seek him more, which I hold to be his desire. I hold that much of the book contains writings inspired by the Spirit of the Creator. But the book is not a club or a heavy weapon to beat people into agreement with, and it is subject to different interpretations. Only the Creator has all truth. I would suggest for your consideration that the exact age is not critical, but the principle of a recent event is important. A debate as to whether the flood occurred at exactly 2345 BC or 10,000 or 20,000 years ago is not that critical, but it is important to decide whether there was a global flood, and your view on this information may point you to some major decisions. To sum up, there has to have been a massive global hydraulic and tectonic event, a flood. Engineering principles say that long-range extrapolation is unwise and reckless. Sharp young rocks everywhere point to a young age. Historical accounts point to less than 4,500 years ago. What should you do? And what questions should you ask?
There was a judgment by the Creator on humankind for their sin. It's an important question, because if we're just somewhere here doing what we're doing and not going anywhere that we know of, I think you might live your life very differently to if you were convinced that there really is going to be a lake of burning sulfur brimstone, where those who fail to qualify will spend eternity. And that on the other hand, there is a place of great beauty, and that there are even thrones for those who truly seek to serve the Creator. And I'm going to ask you, if you're skeptical, just to bear with me. Hear me as an engineer, as a scientist, as a person who thinks critically. And I ask you to do the same. Think critically. I don't expect you to believe anything that I say, but I do ask you to think about what I've said and go and check it out. Because I suggest for your consideration, it doesn't matter where you are on this planet right now as you watch this. If you go and look in your immediate vicinity, you will find massive evidence to support a global flood. And then there's the question mark. Did it just happen? Or was there a judgment involved? Come with me and let's look at some evidence.
So we find overwhelming evidence of a global hydraulic and tectonic event. The South African goldfields comprising sedimentary layers over 2 kilometers thick. Sedimentary rocks all over South Africa and all over the world speak of a massive flood event. The Halfway House granite dome, molten rock upthrust by at least 5 or 7 kilometers. The top of the dome sliced off level for thousands of kilometers. massive erosion cutting deep valleys into the rock, all point to a massive hydraulic event. And then we find that an ancient book, Genesis, confirms that this happened relatively recently, about 4,500 years ago. What if the Genesis account is reasonably accurate? We've established that Genesis is a reliable historical account to the extent that it reports a flood that destroyed the earth. What if Genesis is correct about the existence of a creator as well? And what if Genesis is correct that this almighty creator judged mankind with a flood and forewarned a man called Noah to prepare a survival vessel in order to escape? What if there's going to be another judgment and we are again being given advanced warning in order to escape? Are you prepared? So we find that the Ark of Noah gives solid evidence of judgment. In Genesis it's written, "So Yah, the eternally self-existing, or the Lord, said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth." And we see a few more images there of the discovery site where they've been excavating the Ark and what it looks like. We find evidence all over the world of fossil graveyards, massive deposits of skeletal remains. We find that Genesis claims that the Almighty warned Noah and told him to build a ship, an ark, a container, and that he would bring flood on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which the breath of life, everything that is on the earth shall die. I suggest for your consideration that the existence of the ship evidence that the Creator warned Noah. If there was generally available evidence of a coming flood or ice object strike or flyby that was capable of destroying the planet, there would almost certainly have been other survivors. There is no evidence of more than one survival vessel. There's no evidence of more than one genealogy surviving. I take this as strong evidence that the Creator did indeed speak to Noah, and that the flood was a judgment. Let's look at some other signs of judgment. An army drowned in the Red Sea, cities turned to ash, a fire-blackened mountaintop, a split rock with erosion channels. Turning to Exodus about 1555 BC, speaks of the Egyptian army being drowned in the Red Sea, and we find that the crossing site has been found with the remains of chariots, horse and human skeletons, and other artifacts found at that location. This took place at a place called Nueba, which you can see from Google Earth is a real place, on the Gulf of Aqaba on the right-hand branch of the Red Sea, exactly where Exodus positions the crossing site. And what happened was that the river on the left and the river on the right both discharged erosive material into the sea and built up a sand bridge just under the surface of the water. And Exodus says that this water was separated by a wind. Technically, this is quite possible. And as I've stated, the remains of the army have been found. Then we find in Genesis a report of cities called Sodom and Gomorrah, where it is said that the Almighty rained fire and brimstone, burning sulfur, from the sky and turned the city to ash. And there on the right you see a sulfur ball that was found at Sodom, in the remains of the cities called Sodom and Gomorrah. There are millions of these sulfur balls, and they light easily. And on the bottom right, the remains of a rampart. A few more examples. The geographic location is exactly where Genesis says it will be, and we see the aerial views showing the location of these various cities. Here we see a couple of photographs of the ash remains on the left and an artist's reconstruction on the right of what it probably looked like. And so we can see very clearly that the Genesis account is an accurate account of what we find. Again, I stress that I'm looking at Genesis and Exodus as simply historical books. I'm not ascribing any supernatural characteristics to them. We find also in Exodus a discussion of a situation in which Moses allegedly struck a rock and water flowed out, and on the left we find a split rock with water erosion channels. And on the right-hand side we see the top of a mountain that has been blackened by fire, just as Exodus says in Exodus chapter 19. Exodus claims that the Almighty descended on this mountain in fire, and that when he came down on the mountain, he spoke out to millions of people, 10 commandments, 10 laws, which start out with I am Yah, the eternally self-existing, commonly referred to as the Lord, your mighty one, or commonly referred to as God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other mighty ones before me. Commandment number 2, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in earth above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water underneath the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. The 3rd commandment, you shall not take the name of Yah the eternally self-existing, or the Lord your mighty one in vain. For Yah the eternally self-existing will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. 4thly, remember the Sabbath day, or Saturday, to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th is the Sabbath of Yah the eternally self-existing. In it you shall do no work. You, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger, who is in your gates. The 5th commandment, honor your father and your mother. The 6th, you shall not murder. 7, you shall not commit adultery. 8, you shall not steal. 9, you shall not bear witness. 10, you shall not covet. This is the only time in recorded history that I know of that the Almighty Creator has appeared in a manifest form and spoken to millions of people. Accordingly, what was said there should be viewed as being extremely important. The 10 laws or commandments are therefore the most important laws ever given. Continuing in Exodus 24, it's reported, Then Yah the eternally self-existing said to Moses, Come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I will give you tablets of stone and the law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them. And there you see an artist's representation of what they think that those tablets of stone might have looked like. We read further that Moses made an ark of acacia wood, a container, a receptacle, and he put the tablets in that container. We read much later on in Kings, part 1, chapter 8, that nothing was in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone which Moses put there at Horeb. And on the right we see an artist's impression of the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was hidden about 597 BC, at the time that Babylon attacked Jerusalem and that the people of Israel went into exile. Those tablets form the basis of the covenant, and in terms of the covenant, if you break those terms, you will die. There's no reported information about the Ark of the Covenant from the time of the Babylonian exile, but there's no indication that it was taken into exile. The Ark was discovered in 1982 by Ron Wyatt, hidden in an excavated cave outside the walls of Jerusalem, under a hill called Skull Hill, which looks like a skull, and corresponds closely with Matthew 27:33 and other verses. This cave is 6 meters under an execution site that bears close resemblance to that described in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And there's an earthquake crack, referred to Matthew 27, verse 54, that cuts through the middle stake or crosshole. And on top of that, there's blood with only the female chromosome that has flowed down the crack onto the mercy seat of the ark. This discovery provides close correlation with the 4 historical accounts that deal with the death of a prophet commonly known as Jesus Christ. His actual name was Yahushua, meaning Yah the Almighty is salvation, and Christ meaning anointed with the Spirit of Yah. So the name Jesus Christ would be more accurately translated as Yeshua, anointed with the Spirit of Yah. Anointing refers to the presence of the Spirit of the Creator, Yah, on a human being, metaphorically compared with smearing with oil. This man died on a stake or a tree trunk, not a cross. The cross is a demonic sign, an ankh, which is in fact a pornographic symbol. And so we find, for those who have studied these writings, that the only way that some of the things that are claimed for this man, Yeshua, the anointed of Yah, or Jesus Christ, the only way those things could have come into existence was in fact for him to have died the way he did and for his blood to flow onto the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. There's more information regarding this in the endnotes to this DVD, and other information is available from us, admin@etimin.org or graysales@bigpond.com. So we see that there are signs of judgment. We find the flood and the ship of Noah. We find the fire-blackened mountain. We find the execution site with the earthquake crack. We find the Ark of the Covenant with blood on the mercy seat. We find the tablets of stone with the 10 Commandments. And I suggest for your consideration that this forms a basis for careful introspection and self-examination. And so we see that in a very real way, Northcliffe is very visible evidence of a flood, and therefore, if you like, a sign of judgment. And I suggest to you, whatever mountains are close to you, whatever valleys and gorges are close to you, these too represent signs of judgment. Signs of massive tectonic upheaval, massive depths of water, massive water action laying down sediments. In certain cases, massive domes, upthrust, water action cutting off the top of the dome in the case of the Witwatersrand. Massive water action cutting the valleys into the dome, or cutting away the material on the side of Table Mountain, or cutting out the gorge that you see there of the Grand Canyon or Niagara Falls. In fact, almost everywhere you go on earth, you are surrounded by signs of judgment if you have eyes to see. Are you prepared like Noah? Or this begs the question, is there another judgment, or is this all history? Should you be concerned at all this? Or is it just history and nothing to worry about? Did Yeshua live and die to warn of judgment to come and provide a means for you to escape judgment to come? Or was he just any man executed by the Roman authorities of his time? Let's look at some other indications of coming judgment. The book of Revelation, the last book in most Bibles, said the dead were judged, and anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire. Revelation 21:5-8. He who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his mighty one, and he shall be my son. But the cowardly, unbelieving, abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. Notice that unbelievers are categorized as a specific category, so everything else there refers to believers. And notice that it is possible to have a part in the lake of fire, not just spend eternity there. Some indications of coming judgment spoken by Yeshua. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven. Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Yeshua speaking again, then he will say to those on the left hand, Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. other references. Go to hell into the fire that shall never be quenched. Came to send fire on the earth. Fire will test each one's work. The elements will melt with fervent heat. I'd like to point out to you from some of the images shown in the introduction to this presentation, where we've seen photographs showing millions, possibly even billions of stars, each one of which are at least as hot as our sun, many much hotter than the sun. That eternal fire is technically entirely plausible. On the other hand, there are also alleged to be great rewards. He who overcomes shall inherit all things. I will give to eat from the tree of life, shall not be hurt by the second death. I will give power over the nations. I will not blot out his name from the book of life. I will grant to sit with me on my throne. So this begs the question, where will you spend eternity? What I consider to be the most important document I've ever written is contained on the CD at the end of the set, was available from my website. Where will you spend eternity? It's an in-depth analysis of the Bible or the book relating to coming judgment, discusses the basis of judgment, discusses the continuum from the deepest part of the lake of fire to the highest thrones in heaven. It looks at the guidelines that are given as to how to be favorably rated on the day of judgment. It's vital reading if you have any way been constructively challenged by this presentation to seek a close walk with the Almighty Creator. As I mentioned, I regard this document as the most important item I've ever written, and I've written literally thousands of documents. If you're not sure, ponder. If you've never considered the possibility of a judgment in which you will participate, the last few slides are potentially highly challenging. If you claim to believe in some way and have not realized that you face judgment, the same comment applies. If you have known that there is a judgment and that you will participate but have not realized that you can still face outer darkness or a high throne or anything in between, the same applies. Ultimately, there is nothing more important than where you will spend eternity. I hope that this presentation has challenged you on this. To sum up, there was a global flood. There is a Creator. There will be a day of judgment. There is a lake of fire. There's a place of beauty with thrones for eternity, and we have a choice about how we live our lives. I leave you to reflect on your beliefs and see if they fall into the same category as believing in steady-state conditions on earth for millions or billions of years in an unstable universe. A prayer of repentance if you are a believer but you're not being prepared for judgment. Father, I come to you in the name of Yeshua. I now recognize that there is a judgment to come and that I will participate in it. I'm not prepared. I ask you to forgive my error and forgive my sin in the name of Yeshua. I ask you to lead me and guide me to prepare myself in order that I may overcome in the days ahead and be found a good and faithful servant on the day of judgment. Amen. You can contact me if you need support or more information at james@etimin.org. If you have not previously believed, if you were a cynic or a skeptic and had discounted the flood, discounted the existence of a Creator, and you've now concluded that in fact this is a possibility, you might want to pray something along the lines of the following. Father, I come to you in the name of Yeshua. I recognize that I've not previously believed in your existence, but that you do indeed exist. I ask you to forgive my sins in the name of Yeshua and to give me another chance. I ask you to guide me in all things, and particularly to help me to find the material I need to read, hear, etc., and to meet people who can help me. Help me to overcome to the end that I may be found a good and faithful servant. Amen. Some useful points you might want to pray no matter where you are on this continuum. Father, please bring the people you want into my life and take the people you don't want out. Open the eyes of my understanding to see what you want me to see and close my eyes to what you do not want me to see. Open my ears to hear what you want me to hear and close my ears to what you do not want me to hear. Help me to speak only what you want me to speak and to refrain from saying those things that are not appropriate or not pleasing to you. Lead me in every possible way and teach me to be led by your Spirit. Fill me with your Spirit and let the fire of your Spirit burn out all in my life that's not pleasing to you. Speak to me in whatever way I can hear you, through books, CDs, DVDs, the internet, email, radio, TV, through people I meet, or in any other way I'm able to hear you. Help me to be sensitive to your leading, and help me to know you more day by day.
So far, I've shown you a lot of geology and topography and given you explanations which all my engineering background, all my training in geology, all my knowledge of this area causes me to say to you that with conviction, I hold it to be true. I can evidence it at a level that meets my requirements as a trained engineer for things to mechanically be explainable. I've given you some more abstract information about my faith and my understanding of where we're going. That's a little bit more difficult, and you might want to mull over it, you might want to pray about it, and it might take you some time to say yes, and you might never say yes. And that's your responsibility now, because I've shared what I can. But surely you're asking the question, how on earth did this happen? You have lived on earth all your life and you have never seen such massive events. Yes, we had the tsunamis a few years ago. We live with regular reports of earthquakes and volcanoes, but generally they're far away and they don't really touch our lives too much most of the time, unless a loved one happened to be on that beach that day or on that shore and the volcano erupted. How do we explain massive depths of water-laid sediments? How do we explain massive upheaval of the Earth's crust? How do we explain this cutting down? How do we explain these valleys where the material's just gone? How do we explain those ragged hilltops which haven't been neatly eroded off by water? The stuff's been plucked out of the top of them. The cliffs, rocks have been plucked out of them. How do we explain that? It doesn't fit with what we've been taught. But let's stick with mechanics. There has to have been a massive event that caused massive disruption on this Earth's surface that goes way beyond anything we've ever thought of. So let's go way beyond anything we've ever thought of and see if there's a possible explanation. The conventional explanation is this happened gradually over millions or billions of years, and that the mountains, etc., all formed when the Earth was formed. But somehow we don't find that sort of topography and geology on other planets that I've come across. We don't find water in any sort of quantity on the other planets that are near us. How did we get such a flood? I'm going to share with you a theory, and I want to stress it's a theory. Hold it up and test it against its practical validity. Look for flaws in the argument, but also look for flaws in the counter-argument and see whether you can come up with a better theory. Maybe there is a better theory, but I think this one works. So I'm going to tell you now about the fly past of an ice comet that nearly hit the planet. As it approached the Earth, huge chunks of ice fell to the atmosphere, deluged the planet. The gravitational forces twisted the Earth and the crust broke open. But I'll tell you more of that now.
Going back to something that I mentioned in the introduction, displacement in a steady state situation requires an external force. New movement requires a change in state in terms of the forces acting on an object. Any evidence of a change in state is evidence of an external force acting on the Earth. What do we see? massive sedimentary water-impelled deposits, massive igneous intrusions, massive cutting away, massive erosion, all of which speak to external forces. Much of what follows is a recap of points made in previous sessions. We live in an unstable universe. For example, a runaway star traveling at a speed which would take it from the Earth to the Moon in 1 hour. Massive blocks of ice in space at the Kuiper Belt, not far removed from the perimeter of our solar system. A dirty snowball in space, only 160 times the distance of the Earth to the Moon, away from us, an ice comet, Lulin. Evidence of what looks like an ice object impact on the planet Mars, a crater which doesn't have anything embedded in the middle and limited upthrow of material, which doesn't seem at all consistent with a solid object, but is entirely consistent with a chunk of ice which disintegrates on impact. We look at that crater superimposed on South Africa and see that it is huge. It's possible that such an ice object might melt partially as it passed through the atmosphere, but it would probably still impact the Earth and cause huge forces on the surface of the Earth. Even if it just flew past, it would cause significant disruption. There's some other theories about where the water came from. Certainly an ice object striking the atmosphere would melt partially or completely before reaching the surface. Water in the vapor canopy, which is postulated to have existed before the flood, could have precipitated as a consequence of a comet flyby or impact. Bodies of water stored under the crust, referred to in Genesis as the fountains of the deep, breaking open. Surface disruption triggering volcanoes, and gases released by the volcanoes contain water vapor, condensing as rain. It's entirely congruent with the broad concept of a comet flyby or impact. The exact mechanics are less important than the reality that it could happen and is entirely capable of practical explanation. Looking at continental separation, it requires massive forces and therefore an external source of force. The ocean trenches, another source of drainage, again requiring massive disruption of the surface of the planet, massive ripping apart, not something that is consistent with the steady state situation. In the event of a flyby causing the rotation of the Earth on its axis, we would see massive inertia and drag of the continents overcome by the forces that would result. Theories suggest that the Earth was once vertical on its axis, that it followed a circular path around the Sun in exactly 360 days, and that something happened to cause the Earth to move into an elliptical orbit, to tilt on its axis. Such disruption could cause massive surface disruption. In such an event, if the Earth did tilt on its axis, the surface, the core, the crust, would rotate easily, but the core would stay behind, something called hysteresis, the lag effect. This would result in massive friction between the core and the crust, and that would be just what was needed, A, to separate the continents, and B, to get the continents moving. Collision between the continental masses would be enough to stop them. Looking again at this graphic, we see the continents separating and water draining off into the gorges that are formed with massive velocity, scouring away and eroding the material to give us the landforms that we see all over the Earth today. This is the best theory that I've encountered. It fits for me. It's entirely consistent with the information reported by NASA in 2009-2010. In fact, it made sense to me the first time I heard it about 10 years ago. So I leave you to ponder and take a view whether you've heard of a better theory. It certainly works better for me than to suspend my engineering intellect and training and believe that all the things I've shown you happen gradually over millions or billions of years. To sum up, steady-state theories cannot explain what we've seen in this video. Massive external forces have to have been applied. A massive external source of water seems essential. There are large chunks of ice in space. An astronomical object or ice comet seems to explain the situation perfectly. Is there a better theory? I don't know one. What do you think?
That's it. My time is up. I could talk for hours. As you can gather, I'm very passionate about this and related subjects. I want to leave you with the following thoughts. I truly believe that I have presented you today with incontrovertible evidence of a massive global hydraulic event coupled with massive tectonic happenings. Exactly how it happened, whether there was a comet or something else, that's second order stuff. The fact is, there has been a flood. I've given you some thoughts about coming judgment. I ask you please to seriously think about that. There's a choice, there's a fork in the road. You can reject what I say and continue going down whatever road you're going down. Or you can pause and ask the question. Is there really a creator? And yes, I can't explain where he came from, but it's no more difficult than assuming that all of this stuff around us came from nowhere. It's kind of roughly the same level of faith, I think. Actually, I find it easier to believe there is a creator. And then that there has been a series of judgments. And therefore there is a reasonable possibility that there could be one last judgment. How are you going to live the rest of your life? Depending on which fork you take, could be a momentous decision. If you want more information, contact details are on the screen. Thank you for spending this time with me.
In summing up, I'm going to review the entire presentation. For those of you who want to contact me, you can contact me at james@etimin.org or the phone or fax numbers on the screen. In the introduction, we introduced Northcliffe as a landmark for judgment as the pivot point for this whole presentation. And posed the question, was the topography we see today formed over millions of years, or was it the result of a sudden catastrophic event? And asked the question, how did we explain the mountains and the valleys? We looked at bridges and said that engineers do not design bridges to stand up, they design them not to fall down, and I suggested for your consideration that your theory of topographic formation, your theory of the formation of the earth, your theory of where people came from, should be robust and subject to scrutiny, should stand up and not fall down. I suggested that you checked your theories and see whether it was tantamount to jumping off the top of a high-rise building, flapping your arms and crying, "I can fly," as you plunge to your death, or conjuring a rabbit out of a hat, or whether there was greater substance into what you believed about the topography that you see around you. I presented some of my credentials and made the assertion that I was talking with first-hand knowledge and experience about the formation of rocks, and a variety of the other aspects of this presentation that I was talking about was not theoretical. We had a look at some results from my PhD research and noticed that the characteristics of every single test result was non-linear frequently exponential. And I made the assertion that it is in fact so, that the vast majority of physical phenomena in the world follow nonlinear characteristics. We looked at a fundamental principle that extrapolation should be avoided, and suggested that any form of extrapolation going back beyond where records existed had to be viewed with suspicion. I made the assertion that extrapolation of over millions or billions of years was invalid, taking account of nonlinear characteristics, that it was tantamount to an ant on a railway track, claiming to know where the train had come from, how long it took, and the route it followed. We had a look at some images from NASA with regard to deep space. We looked at the birth of stars and a 3 light-year high pillar of gas that you see there. Notice the instability, the continuous movement. We saw Comet Lulin, a dirty snowball, a mass of ice, only 160 times further away than the moon. In other words, close. And we postulated that such a comet could fly by or even impact the Earth and melt and cause a flood. We looked at massive chunks of ice in the Kuiper Belt just outside the solar system and postulated that one of those could easily get dislodged and strike the Earth or come close to hitting it. And we saw a crater on Mars which seemed to have the characteristics which would be consistent with a strike by an ice object. We saw that catastrophic and dramatic change is fast and not gradual, and I suggested for your consideration that everything that we were looking at in this presentation was likely to have happened quickly. We then had a look at the South African gold mines and saw that they were comprised of very hard metamorphosed rock which dipped at 30 degrees and outcropped on Northcliffe and other areas with glass-like vitrified ceramic quartzite, extremely hard rock. We had a look at the stratigraphic column of the gold mining reserves, which is typically about 2 kilometers deep, and noted that the volume of water required for such uniform deposition is huge, and that there had to be massive water forces to have brought that material from somewhere. We noted also that the deepest mines were over 4 kilometers deep, and that was 2 kilometers below sea level, indicating again massive disruption of the surface. We looked at the 30 degrees dip of the gold mining, of the gold reefs, and questioned how that had happened, how these horizontally deposited layers could have been upthrust like that. We looked at the geology of the surface of the Witwatersrand and saw how massively complex it was and how it spoke of massive surface disruption. And then we looked at a cross-section of the ore reserves, noting that not only did it dip at 30 degrees, but it was intersected with faults thrusting up and down all over the place, indicating massive turmoil and trauma of the Earth's surface. And then we saw that the top of that had been cut off and that horizontally bedded material had been laid down on top of it. We then had a look at sedimentary rock around the world, water-laid rock. We looked at Table Mountain in Cape Town, seeing that its horizontal layers just ended up in the middle of nowhere, just cut off on the sides. We looked at the Fish River Canyon and saw massive deposits of horizontally bedded material with massive canyons incised into it. We saw similar characteristics at Niagara Falls and the Grand Canyon on an even more dramatic scale. Notice the horizontal layers. We saw that massive wave action can move huge volumes of material very rapidly, as evidenced by this storm in Port Elizabeth in South Africa. From there we moved on to the Halfway House Granite Dome, noted that the Earth has a molten core that on occasion has upthrust to the surface. We saw that a dome is a massive granite intrusion, as evidenced by the circular pink zone in the map on the right. We saw graphically how the dome had upthrust and forced up the horizontally bedded layers containing the gold and formed that into the vitreous ceramic quartzite that we find today. We noted that this was consistent with a thin crust, and that this was consistent with progressive cooling and solidifying of the Earth from the outside in. We noted that the characteristics of quartzite were very similar to the characteristics of hard ceramic floor tiles, and the brittleness indicated that the rock could only have been deformed by the dome when it was soft. We looked at bending soft material over a dome and saw what the impact of that would be. From there we moved on to the African erosion surface, a massive flat plain extending over much of Africa and widely recognized. We looked at a panorama from various areas around the Witwatersrand, seeing a uniform horizon, a level horizon, with the same characteristics all over the Witwatersrand. Noting here a slight curvature of the Earth, but the horizon is uniformly level. We noticed that the spot heights around the Witwatersrand were remarkably uniform, and that it would require major feat of engineering to achieve that level of uniformity. We noted that this indicated a massive planing action by some external force, not something that could happen gradually over millions or billions of years. We looked at the art of plane and level, what it takes to produce level concrete slabs, for that matter level cakes, or rectangular and level furniture. We noted that it required specialist tools, and that to produce large level surfaces required a large uniform grading mechanism. We postulated that this grading mechanism could have been massive tsunami waves ripping around the planet uniformly, cutting down layer upon layer. From there we looked at the valleys incised into the dome. We saw that the dome was not a uniform level surface, but in fact that there were valleys gouged into it, huge volumes of material eroded. We noticed that the valleys in themselves were broad and gently sloping, and that this was not consistent with the volume of water flowing in those streams. We noted that gentle rain does nothing. It is all about high velocity water, and we looked at how the use of a water cannon in hydraulic mining moved huge volumes of material very rapidly. We looked at plucked cliff faces around South Africa and noticed that huge blocks of rock had just been plucked out of these cliff faces and were nowhere to be seen. We noticed that on top of the hills we also had similar plucking, huge chunks of rock remaining, but other chunks of rock just disappeared. What should have been uniform deposits, uniform layers, anything but uniform. We asked the question, where is all the rock gone? Because the slope is downhill all the way to the sea, and suggested that at the very least this material had to have been deposited in the low-lying areas of Limpopo province, if not in the Mozambique Channel, and that in addition to this, the material all had to have been removed through the Hartbeespoort Dam Gorge. All of this consistent with huge hydraulic action. We looked at the characteristics of erosion of a small river with a limited bed load cutting a deep channel versus a large bed load cutting a wide flat valley, and we suggested that it was only possible to have cut the valleys that we have in the Witwatersrand around Johannesburg by huge volumes of material traveling at huge velocity. We concluded that the rock was not removed by ice, it did not evaporate, it did not dissolve, and it can only have been eroded by massive water suction resulting from extremely high velocity, possibly coupled with boiling water if the cutting back took place while the granite was still in a semi-molten state. We asked how this could happen. We noted that continental separation was a well-accepted reality with the continents fitting together. We noted that conventional theory says this took place gradually, but from a mechanical point of view, it must have happened rapidly. We noted, in terms of the coefficient of thermal expansion, that if the crust of the Earth had been hot and cooled, that splitting of the crust was almost certain when subjected to very cold water from an ice object. We suggested that the continental separation and the water drainage that would result if this happened rapidly was totally consistent with the landforms that we see all over the planet. We suggested that the trenches like the Mariana Trench were consistent with rapid drainage, and we noted that the sea volume is 18 times the land volume, and therefore it didn't require very much adjustment for the water to come off the land. We looked at the reality that the Earth is on an inclined axis and that the Earth has an elliptical orbit around the Sun, and suggested that the fly-past or impact of a space object could easily have twisted the Earth on its axis and adjusted its orbit, and that both of these would have caused massive surface disruption as the Earth's crust rotated, leaving the liquid core behind, creating huge friction and forces which would easily have separated the continents. We then looked at the age of all of this. We looked at the dilemma of the God's Word phenomenon, people who use the Bible as a truncheon to beat people into belief, and we looked at the reverse problem of people who use intellectualism to beat people into belief, with absolutely contrasting and conflicting theories. We looked at the problem of the clean, sharp corners of the rocks on top of the hills and concluded that it was unlikely that these rocks had been standing there for millions, let alone billions of years. We then examined the ancient book of Genesis, which purports to provide a historical account of a flood and a ship built by a man called Noah, which landed in the mountains of Ararat in Turkey. We reported that that ship has been found submerged in a mud flow with dimensions that exactly agree with the Genesis account and situated in a location that exactly agrees with the Genesis account. We reported that modeling of that, what had been found, indicated that the vessel was completely capable of withstanding the sort of flood event that we were talking about, albeit extremely uncomfortably. Given that we had such a close correlation with the Genesis account, we made the suggestion that Genesis is a broadly reliable historical text, and that we could at least place some reliance on the approximate dating arrived at in Genesis. We also looked at the genealogies in Genesis and found that they correlated with Irish genealogies, and we also found that Egyptian timelines supported the dating of a flood round about 2345 before Common Era or before Christ. We noted also that the technology inherent in the Great Pyramid was more advanced than we have today. We looked at other complications, evidence of a global nuclear war about 4,000 years ago, which would have corrupted any steady-state nuclear decay theory, and also explained Australopithecus and other cavemen as being deformed fugitives from a nuclear war. We postulated that total destruction of the surface of the Earth gave a completely new spin to global warming, explained the rising of sea levels and the drowning of cities, explained that all races traced their origin from a single family, that evolution over millions of years was invalid. We looked at the question of what is the origin and purpose of man and referred to a document which is on the CD at the end of this set. From there we moved on to signs of judgment. We noted that Genesis also claimed that the flood was a result of a judgment by the Creator, Yah, the eternally self-existing, commonly referred to as the Lord, who said, "I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth." We saw also in the book of Exodus an account of a judgment on the army of Egypt, and seen that that had also been found with chariot wheels and human and horse body parts, skeletons on the floor of the Red Sea, where Exodus said it would be. We saw that Sodom and Gomorrah that Sodom and Gomorrah would turn to ash by brimstone in Genesis, and that those had been found in exactly where Genesis said they would be. also as a judgment by the Almighty. We found the split rock at Horeb and the fire-blackened mountain described in Exodus, again where Exodus says it will be. Fire-blackened mountain where the Almighty descended and spoke to the people and gave them the 10 laws, the first one of which is, I am Yah, the eternally self-existing, your mighty one who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other mighty ones before me. And we looked briefly at the other commandments. We noted that Moses was allegedly given 2 tablets of stone with these 10 commandments written on them, which he placed in a container which he called the Ark of the Covenant, which was subsequently elaborately gilded with gold, and which disappeared about 597 BC. We noted that Ark of the Covenant had been found in 1982 by Ron Wyatt, and that this was under an execution site which corresponded very closely with biblical accounts. And we noted that this correlated with the accounts of the death of a man called Yeshua, the anointed of Yah, or Jesus Christ, as you may know him. We noted that this was an extremely powerful confirmation of earlier writings, and that it was strong evidence of judgment to come. And so we concluded that we found numerous signs of judgment in the past: the flood and the ship of Noah, the fire-blackened mountain, the execution site with the earthquake crack, the Ark of the Covenant with blood on the mercy seat containing the tablets of stone with the 10 laws engraved on them, and suggested that this formed a basis for careful introspection and self-examination. We then looked at indications of coming judgment in the book of Revelation, which said that anyone not found written in the book of life would be cast into the lake of fire, and other verses which speak of being cast into the lake of fire. We concluded that with all the billions of suns that have been detected in the universe, eternal hellfire is entirely possible. We also noted that it was claimed that there were great rewards, including sitting on a high throne with Yeshua for eternity. We posed the question, where will you spend eternity, and referred to the document which is on the CD as part of this DVD set. We then asked the question, where did the water come from and where did it go? We looked again at that dirty snowball in space and postulated that one of those could have flown by the planet, dropping chunks of ice which melted and formed rain, or else that one might have collided with the planet. We looked at the ice object that had seemingly struck Mars and noted that that was more than sufficient water to completely drown the planet. We noted the disruption of the surface of the Earth that would have happened if the Earth had tilted on its axis. So to wrap up, my conclusions. Is the planet inherently internally unstable, that all of this could just have happened? Or is the planet stable except when impacted by external forces? Was there an impact or near miss by a comet or other astronomical object? Is our universe stable or unstable? Do we exist in an environment of unplanned, unmanaged, progressive, self-inventing evolution? Or do we exist in a context of an environment that is subject to a higher creative agency, an engineer, a creator? Will we live the rest of our lives as we please with no consequences? Or is there a day of judgment where we will all be called to account for the way we've lived our lives? Is there a penalty for failure, a lake of fire? Are there thrones in a place of great beauty which are a reward for faithful service to the Creator? Are there places in between? Does it matter how we live? I ask you to draw an engineering conclusion. What makes sense to you? Please weigh up all I've shown you and all I've said. Please do not decide based on a whim or what someone else has said. You're an intelligent being. Exercise your intellect to understand the issues and make an informed choice. Make a rational, practical decision, one that you're willing to defend no matter what, something you can hang your hat on. Do you choose to live life at the throw of a dice, or do you design against failure and have a robust view of where you're going. Steady-state theories cannot explain what we've seen in this video. Massive external forces have to have been applied. A massive external source of water seems essential. There are large chunks of ice in space. An astronomical object or ice comet seems to explain the situation. Is there a better theory? I don't know one. What do you think? Was there a flood? Did the flood just happen? Was there a judgment? Will there be another judgment? Where will you spend eternity? My conclusion: there was a massive hydraulic and tectonic event. It was triggered by an externally generated instability. It took place relatively recently. There is a creator. There's looming judgment, possibly within 1,000 years or much sooner. The 10 Commandments will form the basis of judgment. We each have a choice, which ranges from eternal hellfire to a high throne for eternity. What do you choose today? In the endnotes, you will find a variety of information that has a bearing on what you might do once you've considered this information. A high-level explanation of various religious spiritual principles that it is important to know about. Please watch this section as well and read the documents that are contained in the CD that accompanies this DVD. Some acknowledgements: Jonathan Gray for his information and material, Ron Wyatt, who found many of the key archaeological finds referred to here, my parents, my children, others who have been involved in my life. People who've supplied material in various shapes and forms. Particular thanks to Fritz Holscher and Still Point Country Haven for their venue, which is really nice if you'd like to use it. Dave Haraway, who took the photographs. I can be contacted at james@etimin.org or at any of the contact details. Jonathan Gray can also be contacted. I would like to dedicate this presentation to our Creator, the Lord, better, more accurately referred to as Yah, the eternally self-existing, who is the reason for our existence and the source of our being, and who desires our fellowship with Himself for eternity, in whom we live and move and have our being. May Yah, the eternally self-existing, make His face to shine upon you and give you His peace. It's been said that if you do not act on new information within 48 hours, you probably never will. I suggest that right now you write down your top 3 action points before you move on. Make sure that your theory of geological and topographic formation and your religious beliefs are like a bridge, designed not to fail. In wrapping up, what follows is, in my opinion, the most important information on this entire DVD. It does not help to accept that there was a flood if one does not come to repentance and seek a deep relationship with our Father in heaven. It is difficult to have a deep relationship with Him if we do not know the basics about Him. This section seeks to present some critical information which I hope you will find of value. As a fundamental principle, seek truth, not error. Our world is full of error. Do not get stuck on it. I have error I do not know about. Do not get stuck on what you think I have in error. If I knew it was error, I wouldn't have it, would I? Seek the truth the Almighty Creator, Yah, the eternally self-existing, has for you today. When you meet people, focus on the truth they have that you lack and share the truth you think you have. Do not get into arguments. Share what you hold to be truth and gather what another may have that is truth, and then, if you cannot agree, move on. There are many lost truths. Those I think are most important are summarized here. Words in curly brackets are words that are widely used, but which I understand to be incorrect. Talking about seeking truth, not error, the graphic on the screen represents what is known as a radar plot. The center of the circle represents 0% error, and the circumference of the circle represents 100% error. On the left-hand side, we see somebody who has a mixture of a lot of error and a lot of truth. On the right-hand side, we see somebody who has large amounts of error but one or two important truths. In the middle, we see somebody who has a very high level of truth and only one area of major error. Unlikely that anybody on the planet conforms to the middle graphic right now. Looking at a few other examples, more likely that the average person is a big mishmash of truth and error, as represented on the right-hand side. The central graphic represents an interesting situation. Two human beings, both of whom have got a lot of truth and a lot of error, but the truth that the one has corresponds to the error the other has. So while collectively they have a very deep revelation of the things of Almighty, they're at loggerheads because their truths are so different and their errors are so different. There are many errors and confusion relating to the names of the Almighty and to others. The true name of the Creator is Yah, Y-A-H. His most widely used name is Yah, the eternally self-existing, which is frequently translated as Yahweh or Yahweh. His name is not the Lord, which is a literal translation of Baal, which is a pagan name. The Lord is therefore blasphemous and should be avoided, and it is grace that the Almighty has answered prayer in that name. The man commonly referred to as Jesus was a Hebrew. He was not a Greek. Jesus is a derivative of the Greek word Iesus, which in turn is derived from Zeus, which is the name of a pagan deity and is therefore blasphemous. Avoid the use of Jesus at all times. His true name was Yahushua, which means Yah is salvation. This is the message which he came to bring, and he should always be referred to by this name, Yahushua. It is an insult and disrespectful to call the most powerful human being in existence, who is King of all human kings and Lord of all human lords, by anything other than his correct name. God is a pagan name and therefore blasphemous. The word translated God or God means mighty one or almighty when applied to the Creator, or mighty one applied to anyone else. A ruler or judge is a mighty one and can therefore technically be referred to as a god, but in actual fact the word God should not be used at all, except perhaps for Satan in the sense of God or mighty one of this world. Yeshua, Jesus, is a mighty one and therefore can technically be called a god, but it is disrespectful to do so. This duality of meaning gives rise to confusion. The word Christ derives from the Greek Christos. It is used as a substitute for a technical term which refers to the impartation of the Spirit of the Almighty in a form of smearing that is called anointing. Thus Jesus Christ means Yeshua, the anointed of Yah. Christ Jesus means the anointing of the Spirit of Yah that was upon Yeshua. Christ means anointed one or the anointed of Yah. Christ is not Yeshua's name. Christ is not synonymous with Yeshua or interchangeable with Yeshua. Any believer filled with the Spirit of Yah is an anointed one, that is, a Christ. It is confusing and disrespectful to call Yeshua Christ rather than to refer to him by his correct name, Yeshua the anointed of Yah, or simply Yeshua. Yeshua was executed on a stake, a length of tree trunk, not a cross. The cross is a pagan symbol that has pornographic symbolism and should be avoided. The word holy actually means set apart and relates to separation from the things of the world. Bible is derived from the Greek biblios, which means book, as in the Afrikaans bibliotheek, meaning library. The book does not claim a title for itself. It is merely a compendium of writings, and different compendia appropriate the title Bible. The word should be avoided. All versions of the book contain error, and none claim to be without error or fully inspired. There are texts in the book which are inspired by Yah and recorded with varying levels of accuracy. It is an important reference work. Baptize is another confusing term which should be correctly translated immerse. It refers to full immersion in water and is a routine procedure for cleansing that is laid down repeatedly in Leviticus.
It is not mechanically possible to immerse a person with a thumb dipped in a cup of water, and therefore the debate about what constitutes baptism is eliminated. Immersion is the prescribed ordinance of full immersion. We should immerse regularly. Angel is a representation of a word that means messenger. It is more helpful to refer to them as messengers because that is what they are. Marriage means sexual intercourse with a virgin, widow, or truly divorced female. In Yah's terms, the joining of a man and a female in some ceremony is invalid and is an adultery unless the woman satisfies one of the above conditions. Covenant includes a death penalty. Father Yah has made numerous covenants with human beings, starting with Adam and thereafter with Noah, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, David, Yeshua, etc., and with many others. He still makes covenants today. Failure to observe a covenant leads to death. It may result in premature death in this life, failing which it will lead to eternal death. Thus, while much is made of the covenant through Yeshua, it should be seen in context, and it must be understood that willfully and repeatedly breaking that covenant will lead to eternal hellfire, as set out in Hebrews 6. There is judgment in this life. We may request judgment in this life in order that we are not judged in the life to come. We will be judged in any event. Any illness, accident, loss of any sort is a judgment. Judgment requires the prosecutor, Satan, or one of his messengers to bring charges before the court of heaven. Yeshua, as our advocate, pleads for mitigation of sentence, mercy, etc., as may be applicable. Father Yah, as the judge, hands down the sentence. Satan and his messengers and demons execute or carry out the sentence, for example, by causing an accident. Judgment in this life is to be sought and desired. It trains us, it allows us to learn. It is grace that helps us to learn and avoid damnation in the life to come, and if we desire, it helps us to aspire to a high throne for eternity. It allows us to pay the price for our sin in this life, and therefore helps us to avoid a part in the lake of fire for eternity. Pray, Father, I ask you to judge me severely and correct me harshly, that I may serve you more perfectly. Considering the spiritual journey of man on earth over 7,000 years, at the start, just over 6,000 years ago, human beings only knew good. As a consequence of disobedience and rebellion, they started to learn all there is to learn about evil. This generation, 6,000 years from the creation of mankind, is the most evil generation that has ever lived. Yeshua came and died that we might regain authority on earth. We are called to restore good on earth in order that he may return. At present, Yeshua, having been resurrected because he lived a life without sin, is seated at the right hand of the Father, waiting for his enemies to be made his footstool. Looking at this graphically, we see 6,000 years of degradation in terms of the moral fabric of society to where we are today. We see a goal which the Almighty has said for a restoration of truth in preparation for a day of judgment. Satan was cast into the pit for 1,000 years in 2003. 2,000 years ago, Yeshua, having regained authority on earth from Satan by living a sinless life, immediately handed that authority to those that followed him and went to sit at the right hand of the Father to await the time when his followers would regain authority on earth and prepare a place for his return. That is not happening because believers do not understand that it is their role to prepare for Yeshua. They mostly believe that Jesus is coming soon and are sitting back waiting for Yeshua to sort out the mess. Yeshua is waiting for us to sort out the mess. We have less than 1,000 years in which to do this. Some say much less time. Be prepared, no matter the hour of the day. If we truly understood the significance of Yeshua's return, the onset of judgment, we would not be asking for his soon return. This life and the life to come are more complex than most understand. There's a continuum between entirely and completely good, which has only been achieved by Yeshua and Father Yah, and entirely and completely bad, which has only been achieved by Satan. The climb to all good is metaphorically referred to as the mountain of Yah, whereas the slippery descent to all evil is the pit, where Satan is currently imprisoned. If the believers are successful in preparing a place for Yeshua to return to, then Yeshua will return to receive his kingdom, and Satan and his messengers and all those who have not qualified to enter heaven will be cast into the lake of fire. If they do not succeed, then Yeshua will never return and Satan will take control of the earth forever. Here we see a diagram representing the continuum. We'll notice that the majority of people live in the middle section of that graph where they're not really good or bad, but they're not really serving the Almighty. It is difficult to climb up the mountain, hence the image that I've chosen to represent the difficulty of climbing the mountain, and it's relatively easy to slip into the pit. Most people are lukewarm. They're on the gently sloping ground in the middle between serving Yah and serving Satan. Most are oblivious to the battle that is raging all around them in the spiritual realm, and are oblivious to the fact that in the absence of concerted action to climb the mountain of Yah, they will eventually slide into the pit to be cast into the lake of fire on the day of judgment. Climbing the mountain requires constant focused effort, so if you're not consciously seeking to climb the mountain, you're almost certainly sliding away and towards the pit. Yeshua stated in Mark 12:29-30, "The first of all the commandments is, Hear, O Israel, Yah the eternally self-existing Almighty One. Yah the eternally self-existing is one. And you shall love Yah the eternally self-existing, your mighty one, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment." In Exodus 20:3 it is written that Yah said on the mountain, "You shall have no other mighty ones before me." It is therefore clear that it is sin to equate Yeshua to Yah, or to worship Yeshua, or in any way conjoin Yeshua to Yah in the way that is customarily done. The part of Yeshua that was Yah was the Spirit of Yah on Yeshua. To revisit the 10 laws, which were the sole contents of the Ark of the Covenant, and the essence of the covenant made by the Almighty at Sinai. Since Yah appeared in fire on top of the mountain and spoke with an audible voice to several million people, we must assume that these are the most important words ever spoken to human beings, since this is the only time he has appeared so concretely that we know of. The 10 laws will form the basis of judgment. The 10 laws can be summarized as follows. 1. Yah is one, have no other mighty ones before him, includes do not worship Yeshua. 2. No graven images or idols, includes do not worship the Bible. 3. Do not use the name of Yah in vain, includes not using God, the Lord, etc. 4. Observe the true Sabbath, Saturday, and the feasts and the fasts. 5. Honor your mother and father. 6. Do not commit murder. Includes do not oppose the death penalty, do not curse, no abortion, no contraception that causes abortion. Do not commit adultery based on virginity and widowhood as set out above. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness, includes lying. Do not covet, includes lust. So then how did Yeshua become king and achieve what he did? First of all, he was a 100% human being. If he was not a 100% human being, he would have had no rights on the earth. He was born with a creative miracle that is less dramatic than the creation of Adam or the creation of Eve. He had no human father, therefore there were no bloodline curses. He was the first created spirit. He lived with Yah before coming to earth, so he knew Yah well and Yah's ways, and Satan's ways, so he was well equipped. He lived a life without sin, gained victory, and regained authority over the heavens and the earth. He became king because humans proclaimed him king. He became Lord because humans proclaimed him Lord. He became the Lamb of Yah because Yahuchanan, John the Baptist, proclaimed him the Lamb. Through that assignment, he gained the right to take the place of the animal offerings for sin and thus provide a simpler way to forgiveness. He assigned the body and blood of the Lamb to the bread and wine at the last meal with those who followed him most closely, thereby assigning the body and blood of the Lamb to bread and wine, so that all believers anywhere had access to the mechanical ingredients necessary for forgiveness of sin by faith. He became high priest because the high priest laid hands on him in mockery and proclaimed him Messiah, and the blood of the offering fell on the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. He became the offering for atonement because his blood fell on the mercy seat. Also the people laid hands on him for transfer of sin and sent him outside the gate and took his blood upon themselves. There's absolutely nothing magical about what Yeshua achieved, not even anything particularly supernatural. He lived a life without sin. That is the most noteworthy achievement. And he died without sinning. and as a consequence death had no hold on him, and he was automatically resurrected. Death in this life is the price we pay for sin. If we live without sin, we're entitled to be resurrected. Thus far, only Yeshua has accomplished this, and so the position of King of Kings and Lord of Lords is filled for eternity. But through Yeshua's life and death, we have access to repentance, and therefore to eternal life. The beast is another name for Satan, one of his principalities. The mark of the beast is a spiritual mark in the forehead, what we think, and in the hand, what we write and contract that breaks the 10 Commandments, or honors the 10 Commandments. The pit is a prison into which offending spirits are sent until their period of sentence has been served. In addition to the Saturday Sabbath, we are required to observe Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, Pentecost, the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, which is a set-apart fast day, a total fast, the Feast of Tabernacles, in particular the first and the 8th, or Great Day. Some other important points. Muhammad is also a prophet of the Most High, and the Muslims are people of Yah. Allah is the Arabic word that corresponds to Elohim, the Hebrew word for the Almighty. Muhammad correctly rebuked the Christians for worshipping Yeshua and for worshipping the Bible. Islam simply means the worship and service of the Almighty, and Muslim means one who worships and serves the Almighty. Muslims are subject to different covenant terms to those applicable to the children of Israel, and therefore they have to be grafted into the covenant through Yeshua. But this will only happen when the truth about Yeshua is preached and taught. There are other sheepfolds. Yeshua indicated that he had other sheepfolds to visit. I'm aware of one in Central America. There is every reason to believe that there are sheepfolds all over the earth, and that there are other religious groupings that have roots in knowledge of Yah and Yeshua. There is reason to believe that virtually all human beings today are children of Abraham. The nations of Europe are descended from the tribes of Israel that went into exile. Perhaps the most difficult truth today, I've left it to last because so many are offended by this. Listen prayerfully and carefully. Pray about it. If you're not ready to receive it, put it aside until you are willing to consider it, or never. The taking and giving of virginity results in an everlasting covenant. So does sex with a widow or truly divorced female. A female can only do this once, therefore sexual intercourse is one of the most sacred or set-apart acts possible between two humans. It is possible for a man to take the virginity or widowhood of more than one woman, and since there is no turning back, it is therefore possible for a man to be in lifetime sexual covenant or marriage with more than one woman. Yah has granted mercy and grace, but that grace has been withdrawn. Corrective actions are called for. Isaiah 4:1 indicates that there will be 7 times more women than men in the body of true believers at the end, and that is evident today if you look around you. So to sum up, seek truth, not error. Use the technically correct names and terms. Become aware of covenant and the price of breaking covenant. Become aware of and seek judgment in this life. Prepare for judgment at the end. Understand and observe the 10 Commandments. Understand how Yeshua accomplished his purpose. Recognize that there's evil on the earth and seek to overcome in your life. Look for truth in other groups and cease judging them. There are other sheepfolds. Become conscious of virginity, widowhood, and true divorce as set-apart states, and the covenant that follows from change of these states. Recognize sexual intercourse as a highly spiritual and set-apart covenant act. The necessary consequences of recognizing set-apartness of virginity and widowhood. Men can covenant with more than one woman. Refer Isaiah 4:1. Set a clear goal for yourself, for eternity. In closing, in Ecclesiastes it's written, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear Yah and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For Yah will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. If you gain nothing else from this presentation, fear judgment and seek a personal relationship with the Creator, and choose to adjust the way you live your life accordingly. A closing prayer. Father, I come to you in the name of Yeshua. I ask you to give me a hunger for truth and seek to avoid error. I ask you by your Spirit to blow away error in my life and show me how to deal with it. I ask you to help me to hold on to truth no matter how hard it may be. I ask you to help me to overcome to the end, no matter how hard that may be. I ask you to help me to build a deep personal relationship with you. Amen.